Simon & Schuster Audio presents Do I Stand Alone? Going to the Mat Against Political Pawns and Media Jackals by Governor Jesse Ventura. Read by the author.
My first trip to the White House was a humbling experience. My wife Terry and I had flown to Washington for the annual Governors Association Conference, which included a dinner at the White House. The moment we walked in that enormous front door, we just stood there for a moment, in awe. I remember thinking to myself, my God, this is where it all happened. This is where Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy made history. When you arrive at the White House, you go through a receiving line to meet the president. Then you go into the dining room, where they have place cards that tell you where to sit. To help mix things up socially, you don't sit with your spouse. That makes it kind of fun. After dinner, you go to the next room for entertainment and dancing. When we were there, a swing band was playing. The president and the first lady were dancing all by themselves because everybody else was giving them a wide berth. So I took Terry by the hand and said, "Put your champagne glass down. We're going to dance." We went up and started dancing right next to the president and first lady. We were the only other couple out on the dance floor. I thought, who cares? I may never get this chance again. At one point, I leaned towards Terry and said, "You dare me to cut in?" She gritted her teeth and gave me a look that said, "Don't even think about it." But in hindsight now, I bet she wishes I had. The Clintons are very gracious hosts. I think they would have gotten a charge out of it. After the song was over, the Clintons immediately engaged us in conversation. They're great to talk to. I told them about my very first proclamation as governor, declaring February 15th Rolling Stones Day. They thought it was great. I had them both autograph my menu that night. Hillary Clinton signed it with deep admiration and respect. I believe she was sincere. That's coming a long way from the time she arrived in Minnesota during the gubernatorial campaign and told Minnesotans to put aside the circus sideshow act, which was how she referred to my campaign, and get down to the business of electing Skip Humphrey. I don't hold that against her. She was brought in as a hired gun to stump for Humphrey, so of course she had to say something like that. There are all kinds of things that are said in the heat of battle, but when the election is over, you have to move on. That's the way it is in politics. It's incredible to me that less than 2 years ago, I was more or less a political nobody, and now I'm rubbing elbows with people in America's highest offices. In February of 2000, Vice President Al Gore's people called to let me know he was going to be visiting the state and that he would be calling me at home to set up a meeting. The day he was supposed to call, Terry was just walking in the door with an armload of groceries when the phone rang. You know how sometimes when the phone rings you get a premonition of who's on the other end of the line. I just had a feeling that it was Al Gore, so I sat tight and let it ring so that Terry would pick it up. I heard her answer in the other room, then a pause, then she said, "Really?" in an incredulous voice. She thought it was just one of my friends pulling a prank. But it was the vice president, all right. He canceled his meeting with party caucuses that morning so that he could have a breakfast meeting with me. It was just the two of us in a room together for 50 minutes. It's amazing when I think of where I came from and that a little over a year ago I had virtually no political connections. Now the vice president is seeking me out. It boggles my mind that I'm now seen as some kind of political expert. I'm also flattered by the response I've gotten from the public. It's phenomenal. A few months ago we went out to this little bar and burger joint for a quick lunch. We could hear people whispering as we walked in, but they left us alone, waited until we were almost done eating before they started coming up with their kids and asking for autographs. And then as we were getting ready to leave, they all stood up and applauded. And all I did was eat a burger. To what can I attribute this phenomenal outpouring of public support? I have to think it's simply that the public sees my winning the election as a victory for them. They're not showering me with all this support because I'm special, but because I'm an ordinary guy. I'm one of them, and they know I represent them in everything I do. My strength out there is in the silent majority. They don't necessarily speak out, but they're listening. The media, the legislature, and the behind-the-scenes power brokers give me a lot of grief, but I get exactly the opposite from the people of Minnesota. Their encouragement and support is what keeps me going. I'm an anomaly on the American political scene. I'm a private sector guy through and through. I'm not a member of either of the two traditional parties. I have no aspirations to build a political career, so I'm not interested in swapping favors or garnering influence. I answer only to the people. I don't think very many other political figures in high office can say that. It gives me a unique perspective into the state of American politics today. But isn't that what politicians are supposed to be? In a government of, by, and for the people? Aren't they supposed to come from the public, identify with the public, serve the public? How can they claim to serve the people if they're beholden to anyone else? In this program, I'm going to be talking a great deal about the snags in our political system that keep it from working the way it should. But as you're listening, I want you to keep one thing in mind. The greatest threat to our political freedom is not from the career politicians, the partisan gang wars, or the power-hungry lobbyists. It's the apathetic public that allows them to flourish. I'd like to be able to take the people's enthusiasm as a sign that public apathy isn't necessarily a permanent condition. I hope it means that when the people believe they're being heard, they will come back into the system and participate. I dearly hope that that's so. I want to believe that my public service has made a difference, because I'll let you in on a secret. Being in public office is tough. Starting with the moment I threw my hat into the gubernatorial ring, the traditional political power brokers have been doing everything they can to try to knock me out of power. I truly believe that I have gotten more harassment than any other governor because I'm independent and because I'm powerful. I'm a threat, and they have to take me down. At least the politicians' hatred of me is understandable. I'm jeopardizing their comfortable careers, but the media have no excuse for the way they've treated me. They smelled blood in the water, and they've been circling ever since, ready to go on the attack whenever they see an opening. Why? Because sordid headlines make money. If anyone says something derogatory about me, whether it's true or not, whether the source is even remotely credible, they're all too eager to print it. There's big money in character assassination. But it's not just the politicians and the media that make this job difficult. The average American has no idea what kinds of things you have to endure today to serve in public office. Did you know, for example, that I average about a death threat a week? Even my family gets threatened. My 16-year-old special ed daughter has been threatened in vile, horrible ways, and she hasn't ever harmed a soul. She's as innocent as anybody on earth. I don't know if the people who do this are just trying to get back at me, or if it's just that bad people tend to focus on someone innocent. But I have to assume that if these wackos are capable of making threats, they're capable of carrying them out. I may or may not seek a second term as governor. Of course, I don't plan on even thinking about making that decision for another couple of years. But the further I go in this job, with the never-ending media beatings and the continuous hassle I get from the legislature, I'm feeling less and less inclined to sign up for another 4 years of it. Even though there are times when I get depressed and I think this isn't worth it, I'm not running again, I wouldn't trade the experience and the education I've had for anything. And I hope I've done some good, if only to shake up the tired old status quo of public office. Whatever else they say about me, nobody can say I'm your run-of-the-mill politician. Let's talk now about what's keeping the American political system from working as well as it should. The last 2 years' legislative sessions here in Minnesota have been marked with a bizarre spate of name-calling and stupid accusations. In a very unkind article, Senator Dean Johnson accused me of leaving the state too often. But you know what he did the very next day? He himself left the state to go play golf in Alabama. When he got back, I called him on the carpet. I said, "How dare you accuse me of leaving the state when you yourself are doing it? You left right during the session to go play golf in Alabama with lobbyists. Why shouldn't I go public with that?" He backed off real quick on that one. Now he's trying to smooth things over. Representative Gregory Davids also made some strong comments to the press, in which he called me a moron and a fraud. The interesting thing about Representative Davids is that he initially applied to be my Commissioner of Commerce, and I didn't choose him. So you can be the judge of why he feels it's necessary to call me a moron and the biggest fraud he's ever seen. Those are strong words. They're not the kind I can just let fly over my head. I won't necessarily retaliate, but I won't forget. The name-calling has all pretty much started this session. I think it's partly because of what happened last session as we were finishing up. We were putting together an emergency bonding bill for things that had come up since the regular bill had gone into effect a year earlier. I told them that they could have about $100 million for emergency bonding, and they came back in with a request for $150 million. I line-item vetoed about $50 million of it, because there are all kinds of add-ons in their bill that I didn't consider emergencies. Plans for constructing highways and rebuilding bridges. I took that stuff out because that's the kind of thing that belongs in this year's bonding bill. I took some heavy hits for that veto. I was accused of neglecting the rural areas. But I called up my Commissioner of Transportation and I asked him, "Do highways and bridges deteriorate to an emergency status in less than a year?" He said, "No, absolutely not." And I said, "So those weren't real emergencies. If they weren't in bad enough shape to go on the regular bill just a few months earlier, then they weren't in such terrible condition that they couldn't wait a few months more to go on the next bill. So that's where I put them." But the people in the legislature who were pushing for more money were blind to the fact that I did get their money for them, just in a different form. They started screeching about how I'd taken away their funding. That's par for the course for today's career politicians. They twist the truth. They don't give you the whole picture. They only give you the portion that suits their particular agenda, the same way the media do. It's far more common than the public realizes. The legislature has worked hard to put me in my place this year, to show that they can override my vote if they want to. But what they don't realize is, I don't care. If they override my vote, then I've done all I can do to change things, and I go home at night with a clear conscience. There's very little respect for public office these days. My opinion is that you can dislike the person in office all you want, but you still show respect for the office itself. Recently, I was giving a speech to the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, and I started talking about unicameral legislation, which a lot of the legislators vehemently oppose, because if it were to pass, they'd lose their jobs. It doesn't seem to matter to them that it's a much better deal for the public, who they are supposed to serve. They don't like it because it's not good for them. But when I mentioned it, Senator Steve Novak and Representative Dave Bishop actually started catcalling from the audience. I later got a letter from the head of the chamber apologizing for their bad behavior. For the most part, I think the bad behavior is just a symptom. The real flaw in the system runs far deeper than the mere name-calling. The way our system works, it encourages public servants to compete with each other. And when the stakes are high, that competition naturally gets ugly. A large part of the problem is that legislators tend to see people in the party opposite from theirs as natural enemies, and people outside the two parties as an even greater threat. Another flaw in our system is the fact that it encourages public servants to view their jobs as an endless quest to bring more pork home to their districts. I think that's another reason why they hate me. Aside from the fact that I don't belong to either of their parties, I'm always cutting pork out of their bills. My goal is to keep taxpayers' money from being wasted. I'm not interested in doling out political favors, but by making less pork available for them to bring home, I'm thwarting their power. The legislators are used to governors who will offer them pork in exchange for their support at voting time. Rest assured, pork is never handed out for free. and usually the votes bought with that pork are for projects that require even more spending. When political leaders are only out to grab as much of the political pie as they can, it's not surprising that government growth keeps spiraling out of control. Here's a classic scenario of the way pork barrel politics operates. Usually, Minnesota's annual bonding bill ends up being between $400 and $600 million each year, except for 1998, when it shot up to over $1 billion. It was steady for years, then suddenly a gigantic blip on the screen. You know what happened that year? The mayor of St. Paul and a bunch of his cronies decided they wanted to build a new hockey arena. Now, in order to do that, they needed to garner support from all the legislators. How do you garner support? You got it. You start passing out the pork. They used the 1998 bonding bill to dole out favors. That's how they got enough legislators on board to vote for the new stadium. All those little towns got to sneak their pet projects into the bonding bill in exchange for voting for the arena. That's the way the bicameral system works. Their votes may have had nothing whatsoever to do with the will of the people or with whether the issue at hand is good for their constituents. It's all about which side of the vote gets them the most pork. And so, the 1998 bonding bill amounted to $1 billion worth of credit, paid for by the people. People don't generally understand that a bonding bill works in much the same way as charging up a credit card. Sure, you can buy what you want now, but then the bills start coming to your house, and you have to make payments with interest. And, just like with a credit card, it ends up costing you a lot more than if you'd paid cash. In the past few years, bonding has been a reasonable thing to do because the interest rates have been good. But now interest rates are climbing again. I don't think this is a good time to incur a lot of debt. But that's the problem with pork barrel politics. Good sense and fiscal responsibility aren't part of the strategy. Another byproduct of pork barreling is that it encourages public servants to make a lifetime career out of politics. Pet projects aren't the only things that can be bought with pork. Politicians also use pork to purchase power, influence, and votes. A long career of garnering favors can make a politician very powerful and very hard to budge. Take State Senator Roger Moe, our Senate Majority Leader, for example. I have nothing against Roger personally. He's a good senator, but consider for a moment that Roger Moe has been in the Senate 1 month longer than when I deployed to Southeast Asia. I deployed in February of 1971. Roger Moe took office in January 1971. He's been there almost 30 years. The Founding Fathers had in mind that our government was supposed to be of and by the citizens. So it seems a little contrary to the spirit that someone should try to hang on to an office and a power base the way Senator Moe and many others like him are doing. Like many other powerful, long-term legislators, Roger Moe is a big-time opponent of unicameral legislature because he doesn't want to lose his power source. The bicameral system is very much pro-career politician. Roger carries so much power because he's been there so long. If they took him out of office and put in a new senator, the district the new senator represented would fall behind because the new senator wouldn't have any power. He or she couldn't deliver the goods. Career politicians don't like dealing with me. I don't play those games. Political power is gained by playing the trading game, and I won't negotiate trade-offs. No matter how important something is to me, I won't allow the you give me this and I'll give you that game that's become the mainstay of American politics. I'm a firm believer that every bill and every thought ought to stand on its own merits or not at all. I would rather get nothing and keep my integrity than swap one thing for another. That's just a personal value I have, but it's very difficult for old-fashioned partisan politicians to grasp that idea. I think a lot of the mischief in politics today comes not so much from individual legislators as it does from the two parties. It's a lot like going to school where there are two prominent gangs. If you're somebody like me, coming in without an affiliation to one gang or the other, you're put under pressure to join one or the other, just to survive. And if you remain independent, both gangs will try to destroy you. Of course, the analogy doesn't go much farther than that, because gangs will go after you with knives and guns, whereas in politics the weapons are merely words and votes. It's not violence, but it's still warfare. When I was doing talk radio, I loved to refer to the two parties as the Democrats and the Republicans. I'd say that they're really no different than street gangs, except that they wear Brooks Brothers suits. Bipartisan warfare is what's behind most of the gridlock that plagues our government. Many people think that government should support gridlock. They think gridlock is good. Maybe they're confusing gridlock with checks and balances. Or they think that legislation that's held up in a legislature for a while will get all the flaws shaken out of it before it passes. But really, with a bicameral system, the situation is not so much gridlock as it is gridiron. It becomes a fight, a competition, to see who can rise through the ranks and grab the most power. And it's a fight that generally divides itself along party lines. That is, unless an independent or third-party person comes in from the outside, then these two blood enemies will join forces to try to tear the outsider apart. There's only one way I know in today's political world to be able to vote your conscience, and that's if you're outside the two traditional parties. Maine's Governor Angus King is the only other independent governor in the nation, and he's able to vote his conscience. I consult with him a lot. He warned me early on about the way it would be. He said, "1 week the Republicans will love you and the Democrats will hate you. A week later, they'll reverse." I've seen it too. People who will argue vehemently on one issue will be completely in agreement with me on another. I think for the most part that's healthy. That's the way it's supposed to be when people are really debating the issues on their own merits. But the trick is to keep each issue separate and not hold over bad feelings from one issue to another. The most ironic issue was not even an issue. It was my interview with Playboy magazine. Last year, when my popularity was riding high, it was terrifying for the legislators. They didn't dare mess with me. I was polling in the 70s. Then in the fall, I did a controversial interview with Playboy, and they thought they saw a chink in my armor. Keep in mind that the whole interview was just my personal opinion. None of what I told them had any bearing on the way I govern. And when you take a Playboy interview, where they pump sound bites into the media, it sounds much harsher than you intended. To those people who don't read Playboy and don't realize the provocative questions that are asked, the interview can seem offensive, and apparently a good many people were offended. Right after the article came out, in the midst of the media frenzy, my popularity took a nosedive to 54%, which is still hugely popular. But when my opponents saw me go from 70 to 54, it gave them courage. They saw it as an opportunity to move in for the kill while I was down. He's offended the public. We can get him now. Unfortunately for them, I wasn't down for long. Within a few months, my approval rating rebounded to around 68%. Now I'm even more of a terror to them than before, because I can survive the crucible of public displeasure. I'm stronger than ever. So now they're looking to snipe at me any way they can. When I appointed Reform Party member Steve Min as the Commissioner of Commerce and Public Service, they voted him out. It was a retaliatory move. It wasn't a strike at Steve Min. It was a strike at me through him. It was their way of telling me, early in the session, when we all get together, we carry the power. And I know they do. They can override any one of my vetoes. But remember that both they and I ultimately answer to the same authority, the voting public. So how do we stop the politicians from sniping at each other long enough to get them to do their jobs? Frankly, I don't know how much hope there is for reforming the hardcore mudslingers we have in office right now. It's what many of them were raised on. It's the status quo for them. They know no other way. Plus, the way things are done now benefits them personally, and that's what matters most to them. We can police them, we can write them angry letters when they misbehave, but don't count on any of that being too effective. I think we need to concentrate on getting new blood into office, both at state and federal level. We could start paying closer attention to who's doing the mudslinging, and when the election time comes around, we can vote them out of there. Maybe it's time to send the more belligerent legislators a message, and the best way to get that message across to them is with our vote for someone else. I believe our best bet for turning the tide of this nonsense is to go looking for talented people from the private sector, people who are not hanging on the extreme fringes of either party. In fact, today's hyper-partisan political climate makes a good argument for giving folks outside the two traditional parties a shot at political leadership. If we want the bipartisan bad behavior to stop, we may have to do some vigorous house cleaning and Senate sweeping. But our election system as it now stands puts incumbents in a vastly superior position to challengers. The incumbents in the parties make it a very unlevel playing field for the new candidate. I saw a great example of that when I was running for mayor of Brooklyn Park. Every year Brooklyn Park has a big festival called Tater Days. The whole town turns out for the big Tater Day parade, and all of the seated officials get to ride in the parade, pass out campaign literature, the people get to see the names of their council members, they get to see them waving. It's great exposure for a candidate, but it's only available to incumbents. The official filing date for challengers is a month later, so even if they've announced they're running, they're not allowed to pass out literature. It's little things like that that helps keep incumbents in place and keep challengers out. Incumbents, too, usually take advantage of their government paychecks during campaign time, whereas the challenger from the private sector seldom has that option. When I ran for governor, I was made to give up my job as a radio show host in order to campaign because it was deemed a conflict of interest. I went without income for 6 months while I campaigned, yet my two opponents, Skip Humphrey and Norm Coleman, both public employees, kept their jobs and their incomes the whole time, even though they were campaigning 10 or 12 hours a day just as I was. The taxpayers footed the bill for them to do a job they weren't even doing. But if you're not an incumbent or you're not independently wealthy, your chances in an election are almost nil. I don't think people truly realize the sacrifice I made to run for this job. I went from July to January without a paycheck. Put that in the lap of the average wage earner and ask them, would you be capable of going without an income for 6 months? Fortunately, I had enough put aside that I could do it, but I'd be willing to bet most people in this country couldn't manage it. But to the person in office, it's not an obstacle. If I decided to run for a second term, I could spend 6 months doing nothing but campaigning if I wanted to, and I'd collect my check just the same as if I were putting in 10 to 12 hours of state's business every day the way I do now. The incumbent also gets the benefit of all the media attention. There's not a day that goes by that my name isn't in the paper, whether the coverage is good or bad. I remember in the world of pro wrestling, we used to say, there is no bad publicity, just make sure they spell your name right. Incumbents have the benefit of name recognition. If I do run again, my campaign is going to be very simple. I'm going to spend less than I did the first time around, and I'm going to focus all my effort on the last month before the election. I'll go on the radio and TV and say very simply, look, if you want me to do this job for 4 more years, I'm willing, able, and will give my utmost effort to do it. If you don't, elect someone else. And if they don't re-elect me, I'll go back to the private sector with no regrets. I'm a firm believer that that's what a public servant is supposed to do. You serve your time, then you go back to what you were doing before. It's bad enough that campaigns have turned into mudslinging contests, but they have also become entirely too expensive. Today, money dominates political campaigns. When people say they want to run for office, often the first thing anyone asks is not, where do you stand on the issues, but how much money can you come up with? Even a modest campaign takes millions. A lot of talented political leaders have decided not to run, or have dropped out of the campaign earlier than they needed to because they didn't have the cash. As of today, there is effectively no limit to the amount of money a candidate can spend on a campaign. And as a general rule, the best funded candidate is the one that wins. Not the one with the strongest leadership skills, but the one with the biggest bankroll. When campaigns are that expensive, it takes a huge amount of effort to pull together the money required to keep a campaign going. When candidates have to focus so much effort on raising money, they don't have as much time left to devote to the issues. But once they're voted in, they finally get to concentrate on doing their jobs, right? Not necessarily. If they want to keep their jobs for another term, incumbents have to start thinking about getting funded for the next election, sometimes from the day they arrive in office. Many are effectively campaigning all through their term. Members of the two traditional parties have a vast advantage over any third-party candidates. They have much greater funding available to them from their party's coffers. And as I learned when I ran for governor, in some cases the two parties have rigged the system to deny public funds to third-party candidates. There are all kinds of strings they can pull behind the scenes to keep outsiders from getting the money they need. Everything from making sure they don't get access to the government funds they qualify for until after the election, to subtly influencing bank managers to say no to third-party candidates' request for loans. Making matters worse, these days, campaigns are so costly that even party funds aren't always enough to do the trick. That's why many of our would-be political leaders sell their souls to special interest organizations, political action committees, and big corporations. That's where the big bucks really come from. There's no end to the number of special interest groups out there who are hungry for a slice of the political pie. Sadly, that's the way it sometimes works. PACs purchase their own pet candidates by funding their elections. And once these candidates are in office, they return the favor by making policy and passing legislation that helps out their financial patrons. It doesn't sound like there's much room for we the people in that scheme, does there? Voters are getting turned off to the political system in record numbers. In every election, candidates spend more money, and in every election, fewer people vote. You'll often hear candidates say they spend that money to reach the people, but how successfully are they reaching us if fewer of us vote each time there's an election? So, what do we need to do to break this cycle? How can we get the dollar signs out of our politicians' eyes so they can see clearly to focus on the issues? That's the tricky part. In order to effect change in our political system, we have to get the attention of the politicians themselves. And don't forget, if they manage to get into office, they benefited from the system as it is. How excited do you think they're going to be about changing it? Whenever the people get a chance to say something on the issue of campaign reform, most of us are for it. We know how badly it's needed. In fact, plenty of ambitious candidates know how strongly much of the public feels about campaign reform. That's why so many of them trot out some tired line about how important reform is to them. But once we get them into office, they very quickly develop a form of post-electoral amnesia. The reform never happens. So we are probably going to have to take some extreme measures if we want to fix our campaign system and make our candidates behave. I think we need to be talking about making PAC contributions illegal. Candidates tend to pay attention to whoever coughs up the cash. If the only sources of funding they have are from the people, then candidates will have no choice but to listen to us. We also need to fix the loopholes that exist in the campaign funding system. There's already a cap on donations to an individual candidate, but no limit to the amount you can donate to a party. This so-called soft money is then funneled to individual candidates in the form of issue ads. See how easy that law is to get around? I think we also ought to talk about capping the amount that each candidate is allowed to spend on a given campaign. If we did that, it would go a long way towards leveling the field. We have a great political system, but it's got some weak spots that need fixing. As you can hear, we've got a lot of diverse forces working to dilute the power of the average working people. Corrupt career politicians, bipartisan pit bulls, and special interest groups. But the most damaging force by far is an apathetic public. That's the one ingredient without which political corruption couldn't flourish. We can't afford to let ourselves become lazy in our political habits, or we're the ones who pay the price. It starts when we get lazy about forming our opinions. It's just easier to criticize mindlessly than to take the trouble to think things through. That's often encouraged in today's cultural climate. Sadly enough, it's particularly prevalent among young people. These days, cynicism is considered hip. But the trouble with cynicism is that it doesn't do anything constructive. Blind cynicism can only destroy. We're supposed to critique our government. The Founding Fathers designed it that way. We're supposed to be skeptical of our elected officials, and we're supposed to keep a close eye on them. That's healthy and necessary for a democratic society. But there's a huge difference between skepticism and cynicism. We cross the line when we relentlessly tear our leaders down, when we literally go hunting for stories to ruin them. That kind of behavior doesn't serve anybody. We Americans are also lazy about offering ourselves for public service. Many of us don't bother to vote, even in presidential elections. We often don't bother to stay informed on the issues, let alone to seek out diverse viewpoints on them. We seldom do volunteer work for the candidates we like, and most of us never consider running for civic office, even though plenty of local government positions are part-time and flexible to accommodate private sector working people. In recent years, I think we've gotten lazier about building the strong personal characters, principles, and morals that a democratic society requires of its citizens. We live in a very permissive society today, one in which it's widely accepted that the right thing to do is whatever makes you feel good at the moment. We're a culture that, to an extent, rejects all guilt as bad without admitting that there might be times when guilt is appropriate. We tend to fall back on pop-psych excuses for our faults by blaming our personal history, although we're often very quick to point out the faults of others. Yet, if anybody dares to point out ours, we tend to accuse them of judging us, as though judgment, like guilt, is an inherently bad thing. In a cultural climate like this, it's not all that hard for political corruption to find a place to flourish. It's tough to be a politician in today's social climate, because we have become very hypocritical about the demands we make of public figures. We yell that we want honesty from them, but when they give it to us, we crucify them. We've become very good at digging up dirt. We're so good at it, we sometimes even manufacture dirt where there is none. When we do this, we hamstring our political leaders. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. We seem to demand leaders who have never committed a sin. Yet when somebody like Al Gore comes along, polls say he's too boring. We've effectively taught politicians that they're not allowed to make mistakes. It seems as though if they've ever done something questionable, no matter how many decades ago they did it, we hold it against them forever. We are losing out on a lot of good leadership if we refuse to accept anyone who doesn't have a spotless record, as if any of us has such a thing. I'm far more suspicious of the people who claim to have a squeaky clean past than those who honestly, openly admit that they've been wrong. I know you're thinking of one particular president who only admitted he was wrong when he got caught. You're suspicious of public apologies because you've heard some pretty insincere ones from your leaders in recent years. So, how do you sort sincerity from insincerity? How can you tell when someone is truly reformed? There is no foolproof way to do that. But if a public figure owns up to his or her past mistakes, can clearly explain why what he or she did was wrong, has made retribution, and has built up a long track record of doing things right, that's a pretty good indicator they've learned from their mistakes. A person who has honestly learned from his or her mistakes is potentially a very effective leader. It takes true character to admit you're wrong. It takes real moral fiber to turn yourself around and do things differently. And people who have learned something the hard way have absolute confidence in their convictions. They've been on both sides of the issue, and they know which one is wrong and which one is right. They're in a position to lead powerfully on that issue. Ironically, what our society has become is a direct result of our prosperity. The petty whining, the mean-spirited criticism, and the endless obsession with scandal. Those are hallmarks of a society with a lot of free time on its collective hands. Only the well-off truly have the luxury of being self-absorbed. We tend to imagine that we have huge problems. We don't. We hardly even know what real problems look like. In more troubled times, you didn't hear the kind of whining that you hear now. In the whole first half of this century, Americans were struggling to get through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a hell of a lot of racist and sexist oppression. Character, honor, and optimism were tools that came in handy during these times. Does relative peace and prosperity have to mean that we become trivial and self-absorbed? I hope not. We still have free will. We can choose to become whatever we wish. We can make better choices in our lives and in our politics. The same principles that laid the foundation for the peace and prosperity that we now enjoy also made certain that our government would forever belong to us, the American people. If we don't like what we see in politics, we have all the tools we need to change it. All we have to do is make up our minds. Let's talk now about the damaging role the media plays in politics. I have lots of personal experience with the media's irresponsible behavior, but here's one story. When I was mayor of Brooklyn Park back in the early 1990s, I was a speaker for Drug Abuse Resistance Education, also known as DARE. It's an anti-drug program for teens. I like to talk to kids not only about illegal drugs, but also about one of the worst legal ones, chewing tobacco. I'd tell them, are you prepared to chew it your whole life? Because you'll become addicted. It's not something you chew today and then don't chew tomorrow. I could speak with authority about the stuff because I used to chew Copenhagen. I stopped cold turkey the day a dentist friend showed me the lesion on the inside of my lower lip that all tobacco chewers get. He told me, as long as that lesion's benign, you're fine. But if it's malignant, they'll cut a third of your face away in less than 3 weeks. Now, I hope to have grandkids someday, and I don't want to think of me as a monster, so I quit. That speech goes over very effectively with the kids. But one Sunday, a huge headline popped up in the local paper, accusing me of having been seen smoking a cigarette at Target Center Auditorium, a smoke-free building. The article even claimed that when someone asked me to put it out, I got belligerent and ground the cigarette into the carpet. The writer accused me of being hypocritical for my anti-tobacco stance. Her article used words like idiot and musclehead to describe me. Well, I don't know who she might have been talking about, but it wasn't me. I was at a horse show with Terry in Cannon Falls that night. I had dozens of witnesses who saw me in Cannon Falls, and here's the real kicker. I don't even smoke cigarettes. I never have. This reporter hadn't bothered to check her sources. All she needed was to hear the same gossip over the phone from 3 different witnesses, each of whom supposedly saw a large man wearing a bandana and smoking a cigarette. I got her to retract her statement in her regular column, but she never did personally apologize publicly or privately. And of all the kids who saw that headline and thought I was a hypocrite, how many actually saw her retraction? We thought about suing to get her to reveal her sources. A judge might have decided that she had to reveal their names, and who knows, it may have turned out that she didn't have any real sources. She could just as easily have made them up, but in the end we decided not to go after the sources because the retraction was what we really wanted. That same journalist also published an article about a prominent Minneapolis businessman getting arrested in Colorado on cocaine charges. It turned out it wasn't even him, but a totally unrelated guy with the same last name. She didn't even bother to check. After that, her column did not appear for a while. But how will that businessman ever fully restore his reputation? That's all it takes. Journalists can ruin a public figure's credibility with stories like that, and they do, and go home to dinner without a worry in the world. They think the First Amendment makes them immune to responsibility and liberates them from conscience. This kind of thing happens all the time, all across the country. Today's media are obsessed with portraying the ugliest side of humanity: dishonesty, hypocrisy, ego battles, and fights. It's not enough anymore just to report the news. They've got to make the news sexy. Their main criteria for the stories they write are not what's newsworthy, but whatever gets the public's attention. Scandal sells, so that's what they write. Many of them don't care if they have to make it up. They can always hide beneath the umbrella of protecting their sources. They always have a way out. In fact, why should they bother to go through the trouble of writing a credible, carefully researched story when they have a deadline coming up and their editor will probably just tell them, punch it up anyway? Nobody's holding them accountable for the stuff they write. As long as they're selling lots of papers, they know they'll have a job. The media today are all about making money. They say they're not, but they are. They do whatever it takes to get the juicy stuff, because the juicy stuff makes them richer. They'll try to scoop stories that haven't happened yet. They don't respect no comment anymore. They'll just badger people until they get something. I've had journalists tell me, we have leaks from your administration who have told us, when I know they haven't. They go out of their way to tear down, to ridicule, to criticize. The press is supposed to criticize our political leaders. That's the main reason the Founding Fathers gave us free press. It's the press's job to help us keep politicians in line by keeping our actions in the public eye. In monarchies and dictatorships, if you criticize your political leaders, you quickly find yourself being marched up a long ladder and down a short rope. So we should be thankful as hell we live in a country where the press is free to criticize government officials. But a criticism is not the same as a personal attack. My dictionary says criticism is an art. It's the art of making discriminating judgments. It's an evaluation tool. To form a solid, fair criticism of someone's position, you first have to verify what the person actually said. But people are misquoted and taken out of context every day. Then you have to make sure you understand what the person really meant. no fair intentionally misinterpreting them. Then you have to evaluate it, check the facts, and look at it from several points of view. And finally, you have to go through the same regimen with your own opinions to see how they stack up. Thinking takes work. That's why, as I once heard someone say, it's a lot easier to point the finger than it is to point the way. Besides, why do all that work when blatant attacks sell more papers? Journalists love to portray every story as a battle because that's what gets the public's attention. The American public loves a good fight. Look how often the headlines describe two opposing viewpoints as a war. They did that with me and Ross Perot. One reporter wrote a headline that declared, "Venturans versus Perot bots, open war in Reform Party." Come on, I'm not at war with the man. We disagree on a few parts of the Reform Party platform, but instead of debating the merits of each of our positions, which would be helpful, this reporter chose to make it sound like Perot and I are dukes up in some stupid clash of egos. The media's policy of turning every story into a fight is frustrating the hell out of public officials and civic leaders because they feel that they can't get their information across to the public without it being twisted into a stupid showdown. And it's ultimately dumbing down the American public, because when we're getting it reinforced to us day in and day out that there are only two sides to every story, after a while we start to believe it. We begin to assume that the issues really are as cut and dried as the media tell us they are. You're either for us or against us. I've also come to believe the media doesn't want anyone to have heroes today, because whenever someone gets to the status of hero, the media really go into the search and destroy mode. It's almost as if they're saying, this guy's human, he's not really a hero, we're going to prove he's not. Suppose it's a firefighter who pulled somebody from a burning building. They'd go looking for somebody who will say, I knew that firefighter when he was a drunk and his wife left him. Then they'd splash all over the headlines, former hero has checkered past. And the public may get so caught up in the intrigue, they'll forget all about the fact that that firefighter walked into a burning building and saved people's lives. The media are constantly circling like sharks, waiting for you to drop your guard and leave something dangling. First they buddy up to you, and they write all these glowing stories about how refreshing and truthful you are, and they get you to open up to them, so you start believing what they're writing about you. You start trusting them, and you think, wow, they really do want to hear the truth. They really like me. They keep feeding you more line, and then suddenly they yank on the hook. And then, all of a sudden, you're not refreshing anymore, you're abrasive. You're not telling the truth, you're an embarrassment. And the real kicker is, it's the same people saying these things who used to be yodeling about how great you are. Journalists go looking for one piece of a story that will generate outrage, and they ignore the rest of the story, especially those parts that contradict the small piece they've chosen to focus on. For example, when they asked me to comment on the tailhook scandal, the very first words out of my mouth were, I don't condone it. I went on to explain the reasons why I thought a phenomenon like tailhook happened, and that, to an extent, we brought it on ourselves by creating warriors who lived beyond the pale of societal norms. But the reporters simply ignored my first sentence and my second and my third until they found something that made it sound like I was excusing the airman's behavior. And that's what they ran with. How is that helpful to the public, for the media to deliberately distort what I was saying? And woe unto the public figure that tries to correct the press's statements. If we say that a particular headline was wrong, we get accused of waffling or whining or of trying to whitewash our comments. If we fight back, we get accused of being thin-skinned. But what are we supposed to do? We can't just sit quietly while they destroy our reputations. The alternative is to become scrupulously careful about what we say. In today's climate, public figures don't have the luxury of expressing opinions on extracurricular subjects. I learned that lesson the hard way after my interview with Playboy magazine in October of 1999. An unbelievable amount of fallout came from that one interview. I got called on the carpet by hundreds of reporters over a half a dozen different issues. But the one that has been the most misinterpreted by far was my comment on organized religion. I admit that when I said organized religion was a crutch for weak-minded people, I should have clarified that I think some religious people are weak-minded, not all. The ridiculous thing is that at the moment that I made the comment, we weren't even talking about religion in general. We were talking about the way the religious right tries to push their beliefs on everybody else. To me, that's a misuse of religion, and it's those people who misuse religion that I believe are weak and need strength in numbers. Now, I'll fully own up to the fact that I didn't state myself very clearly during that interview. I abbreviated my point, when if I'd had the luxury of more time, I would have been more careful to clarify what I meant. The interview came at a time when I had a gazillion other things on my mind, and at a time when I was averaging about 5 interviews a day, all of which had to be squeezed in and around the state's business, which often has kept me busy until late in the evening. I didn't mean to say that all religion is a sham, and I certainly don't think that all religious people are weak-minded. The truth is, I can see that the vast majority of religious people derive a lot of benefit from practicing their faith, and I'm fully aware that being openly religious takes strength, especially in today's intolerant social climate. But I tried to express way too expansive an idea in a little span of time. The interviewer knew what the context of my comment was, but chose not to include it because the omission made the interview more sensational. The media were overjoyed. Ventura's finally shot himself in both feet. It was pretty disgusting how gleefully they went to work plastering that comment all over the place and extrapolating all kinds of things from it that I never meant. But worst of all was the way they went after Terry for the things that I had said. They cornered her when she was appearing at a horse show to raise money for a disabled children's riding therapy program. Terry's security literally got into a pushing match with one reporter. The next day, they followed her into church and sat there throughout the whole service. She told them no comment 3 or 4 times, but they didn't take no for an answer anymore. They were so aggressive about going after what they wanted, they didn't care if they disrupted the service or if Terry was in tears. They were going to get their interview. The Playboy mess drove home a lesson that I've been learning all year. Don't hand the press ammunition. I'm under so much scrutiny these days that I can't talk freely. The media frenzies that result threaten to monopolize all my time. It's gotten to the point where, to counteract the situation, I only talk to the media about policy. I don't even talk about personal stuff anymore. But no matter how much I button my lip, and no matter how much I try to clarify what I meant, that misinformation from the Playboy interview is still out there. Rest assured, if I run for re-election, I'm going to have to relive the whole hoorah all over again. It's nothing new to see the media going on the attack. As long as the idea of a free press has been around, reporters have gone on the warpath. But there's a major difference between the way it's done today and the way it's been done throughout history. In the past, most of the time, when the media went after people, it was because they truly believed that those people were in the wrong. There was a passion behind their attacks. Their hearts were in it. Today, the media's policy is attack now, figure out why you're attacking later. I don't pretend to know exactly what caused the American media to get stuck in the attack mode, but I bet it had a lot to do with Watergate. Remember, back then we were still deep in the question authority era, when every institution was suspect and every leader was assumed to be corrupt. Then along came this blatant breach of public trust at the highest levels of government. A lot of journalists made their fame and fortunes off of exposing Watergate. It was a real coup for them, and it created a precedent. Where there's a scandal, there's a journalistic career waiting to be launched. But what happens when there isn't a scandal waiting for journalists to jump aboard and ride to fame and fortune? That's when we get into an era we now see around us. If a scandal is what it takes to get the public's attention, you can build your own. Strip down that bland news story, dress it up as a scandal, and watch it take the country by storm. This has had a devastating effect on our public leaders. Everybody's walking on eggshells because they know the slightest misstep is going to land them in a world of hurt. Back a few decades ago, it wasn't uncommon for public figures to feel relaxed around the media people and even spend time just hanging out with them casually. They had a chance to form bonds of trust and friendship, and in that atmosphere a lot more genuine information could come across. But today, hanging out with the media would be kind of like taking a leisurely dip in a shark tank. In my opinion, 60% of what the media puts out today is fact, and 40% isn't. People need to understand that when they listen to something the media has to say, there's maybe slightly better than a 50-50 chance that what they're hearing is true. Almost as likely as not, they'll throw out some flashbang story because it sounds good. There's almost never a follow-up, even if the story is proven untrue. And even when there is a follow-up, the odds of getting it at the same level of coverage are tiny. Many lies are perpetrated today by our own media just for the sake of having a novel, titillating story, something that will grab ratings. The public has very little recourse against the media's power, but the public servants have even less. That's how NBC was able to make a movie about my life, with all kinds of falsehoods and misrepresentations, and I couldn't do a thing about it. The media have full reign to say anything they want to say about me, because I'm a public figure. They can get away with it. But does that apply to my relatives, whom they grossly misrepresented? They're not public figures. It was completely legal for NBC to make a profit by misrepresenting me, but how does that extend to my family? The media get away with all of this garbage because nobody is holding them accountable. Whose job is it to do that? It's not the government's job. The government should never get involved in policing the media, because the First Amendment forbids them from having any control over what the media say. What about libel suits? Well, that's the problem. The media are allowed to protect their sources. You'd have a hell of a time proving that somebody intentionally committed libel if you can't even point out who made the statement. Do you see how badly this can be abused? When the newspapers know they don't have to reveal their sources, they know they can get away with using sources that aren't credible. They can misquote their sources if it serves them. There are probably times when they don't bother to use a source. They simply tell an out-and-out lie. There's nothing stopping them. And an unreliable media is particularly hazardous to our political system. Information is crucial to a free society, in which every individual makes his or her own choices in life. A democratic republic requires an educated, well-informed society in order to function. Where do we get the information we use to make these choices? The media's job is to keep us informed. If the quality of the information they give us is flawed, then how will we be able to make sound decisions? I'm sure the vast majority of young journalists start out with good intentions. They all go through journalism ethics classes in school, and in the beginning they may fight hard to verify their information and check their sources. But after a while, they probably get worn down by deadlines and the push for ratings and editors who keep hollering at them to give it an edge. It's not easy to swim against the tide when you know they can replace you at any time with somebody who's willing to play dirty, especially when the only barrier to writing irresponsible stuff is their own conscience. But ultimately, I believe that if we want to find out who's really to blame for allowing our media to degenerate, we'd better look in the mirror. Nobody's walking into our living rooms, grabbing our remotes and switching the TV from CNN to Extra. We're the consumers. The only reason why the media can make a profit off the scandals they generate is because we provide them with an audience. What's the matter with us? Are we so desperate for entertainment that we have to go looking to the evening news for it? The news media has no business trying to entertain us. Their job is to provide us with reliable facts so that we can make up our own minds about what's going on. They have no business telling us what to think. It's our responsibility to do the thinking. When we become passive consumers and allow them to do our thinking for us, we've agreed to let them lead us into any opinion they like. Don't forget, a sound opinion isn't their goal. Their goal is profit, no matter what the social cost. They're getting fat off our appetite for sleaze. And if we don't speak up and tell them to knock it off, what's their incentive to stop? I'm luckier than many other public figures because I have an effective weapon against the misinformation of the media, my own radio show. When Lunch with the Governor broadcasts on WCCO each Friday, I have a solid hour where there's no barrier between me and the public. The local media rails against the show because they don't like it that I found a way around them. They hate it that I have an opportunity to tell the people directly about the way the media has manipulated them on a given issue. Since I've been doing my show, I've had people call in and confirm what I'm saying. People who have talked to the media and then seen how mangled and misleading their quote comes out looking. They tell me, God, they didn't even print the point that I was trying to make. And when they realize that I have to go through that day in and day out, these people become very sympathetic with me. There is a way to keep the media from getting out of hand. There's only one sure power that we have over the media, and that's our power of choice. Television, radio, newspapers, and magazines are all capitalist ventures. They only survive if they supply something the public wants. If we don't want our news to degenerate into soap operas, we've got to vote with our pocketbooks. We've got to be responsible news consumers and pick the news outlets that behave responsibly. As a society, we have to become much clearer on what is and what is not newsworthy. News is the stuff that affects the public at large. If it affects only me and my family, it's not news. My personal life is nobody's business but mine. I'm a governor. That's the reason I'm in the public eye. All I ask is that you judge me on things that affect my ability to govern. Anytime the media starts concentrating on something other than the issues that affect the public, they've overstepped their bounds, and it's up to us to nip it in the bud. We can also influence the media's output by speaking up and making our expectations clear. When they focus on scandal instead of news, when they report intrigue instead of facts, we need to voice our disapproval. We need to call and write, even threaten to cancel our subscriptions and switch to the competitors' programs if need be. They're a commercial enterprise. It behooves them to listen to their customers. If enough of us speak our minds, they'll pay attention. Of course, I can't say all these negative things about the media without also acknowledging the people who are doing a good job. There are a few outstanding exceptions. The national press doesn't go in for nearly as much of the sensationalism and character assassination as the local media do. Chris Matthews, whose show Hardball is one of the better programs out there. Geraldo Rivera's always treated me fairly. They ask good questions. They don't take cheap shots. They don't seem to be saying, the way the local media do, let's take this guy down. He must have a skeleton in his closet, and by God, we're going to find it. I have the utmost respect for Sam Donaldson, Cokie Roberts, and George Will. Tim Russert of Meet the Press has been a good sport. I've had some fun with him. You've probably seen how often the media likes to get me on their shows. And then they put up some bizarre picture of me from my wrestling days, where I'm wearing a pink boa and they say, look, there's the governor of Minnesota. Well, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to turn the tables just once. One of Tim's old college classmates sent us a photo of Tim back from his college days. In this photo, Tim could be the twin brother to Meathead. Rob Reiner's character on All in the Family. The same beard, the same hair to the shoulders. So the next time I went on Meet the Press with Tim, I came prepared. He just happened to start talking at one point about some photo of me, and I said, "Speaking of photos, Tim," and I whipped out this college photo and asked the camera guy to zoom in on it. I said, "I want the people to see the real Tim Russert." I could tell he was really embarrassed, but he handled it like the good sport he is. Now, let's turn from talking specifically about the media to talking about some major social issues we're facing today. In a nation like ours, social problems are everybody's problem. We're all responsible for being aware of them and keeping informed, and we're all called upon to find ways of solving them. Our government can play a role in supporting us as we deal with our problems, but it can't ever take the place of our own involvement. There's no way to make life fair. Nobody can do it, especially not the government. It isn't the government's job to make sure you get a fair shake out of life. When we start asking government to do that, we're asking the impossible. But I think many of us wish the government could fix all our problems. And unscrupulous politicians like to exploit that wish, especially in recent years. Politicians and the media have wreaked havoc on our ability to tackle our own social problems. Politicians do it by promising feel-good, quick fixes as campaign boosters. The media do it by feeding us skewed, inaccurate information. If we cop out and accept the mass consumption viewpoints that the spin doctors feed us, instead of thinking through the issues for ourselves, we're never going to make much headway. So, now I'm going to take on a bunch of the most talked about social issues with an eye towards stripping off the accumulated layers of political spin and media sensationalism. I'm going to hold them up to the light of the Constitution, and then we'll see if we can figure out what government's role in these issues should really be. Once we have a less biased, better informed view of the issues, we can start working on plans for solving problems that have a better shot at truly making an impact. First, let's talk about welfare. I'm not a big fan of government assistance. When government helps you, it's a form of slavery because it's self-reinforcing. Dependence on government engenders more dependence on government and discourages self-reliance. It penalizes people for trying to become self-sufficient by cutting off their aid as soon as they start making money for themselves, even if what they're making isn't enough for them to get by. Government assistance appears to help people, but how much help is it really giving them, and at what cost? It's very easy for us to forget that every dollar that is given to someone who isn't working was taken from someone who is. It's funny how college kids and young people just getting out on their own are very socialist. They're used to getting subsidized by mom and dad, and now they think the government should step in and do the same thing, for them and for anybody who isn't doing well financially. They want the government to take care of all poor people in the world. But as soon as these kids put in a few years of hard work and achieve their own self-sufficiency, their attitudes begin to change. They see their hard-earned tax dollars going to dependent people. Then they get mad. Welfare is often the topic of choice for political spin doctors because it can provoke strong reactions. It can make hard-working people clutch their wallets in terror, and it can make soft-hearted people advocate silly ideas in the name of caring for the less fortunate. But welfare recipients are a small minority in this country. There is no gigantic wave of indigent people with packs of half-wild children threatening to take over the country, as the extreme right would have us believe. Most people who sign up for welfare are off the rolls within 2 years. But increasing welfare handouts, as the left often tries to do, is never going to eliminate the problems that bring people to the rolls in the first place. Welfare statistics are probably some of the most tweaked, manipulated, and doctored figures around. Everybody has an opinion on welfare that they want to promote, but very few of these ideas seem to yield hardcore results. A case in point is the big welfare reform bill Congress passed in 1994, which was spun to look like it would get people off welfare faster. But in reality, the numbers of people leaving welfare in any given year are about the same as they've always been. Everybody talks about welfare reform in terms of getting people off it. But the bigger question is, why are there people on welfare in the first place? In a country as prosperous as ours, the standard liberal answer is because government isn't giving out enough cash to keep them out of poverty. That's the self-destructive, counterproductive line of thinking. If people are poor in a cash-rich country, it's because they don't have the means to tap into our nation's abundant wealth. To me, that means we need to deal with the reasons why people are having trouble tapping in. Handing out money not only discourages the behavior that keeps our nation strong, it also doesn't address underlying problems. We need to focus most of our welfare energies on tackling the real causes of joblessness. You've heard it said that our blue-collar job base is shrinking, that the number of manufacturing jobs is dropping because of automation. If this is so, we'd better acknowledge it and act on that knowledge. If we're smart enough to invent all these machines that put people out of work, we're smart enough to invent the means to put these same people back to work. It makes more sense in the long run to retrain people for the existing job market than to try to manipulate the economy artificially to make work where it no longer exists. We need to work on helping them become more employable. We need to make sure they have access to the education they need, both for the specific job skills and for basic work ethics. We need to look at what's lacking and answer to it. There are some cases in which people aren't even able to handle job training because they don't have enough education to benefit from it. In that case, we need to make sure they get training for their training. Welfare must be organized so it can be reflexive. It needs to be able to look at the causes of joblessness in each case and answer to them. That's the only sensible way for a free society to handle joblessness, to fix the problems that cause it. But another tricky aspect to welfare is, how do we make sure these folks don't starve or get evicted while they're going through job training? Welfare as it exists now isn't enough for anyone to live on. Benefits for families hardly ever exceed $400 a month. Could you live on that? Ideally, then, the goals of welfare must be twofold. It's got to diagnose and remedy the causes of unemployment and underemployment, and it's got to help keep people going, at least minimally, while they're solving their employment problems. Private sector charities could step in and help on that score, but additionally, why couldn't the training recipients themselves work for the welfare benefits they receive, at least part-time? Isn't it possible that they could work part of the day in some kind of job program and attend job training the other part of the day? Or, wherever on-the-job training programs are possible, they could solve both problems at once. There's got to be a half a dozen creative ways of handling this, short of all-out cash giveaways that don't actually solve the original problem. The fact that welfare often doesn't address the causes of joblessness is the big problem. But there's an even bigger one. Who suffers the most when adults don't have decent jobs? Their children. Welfare recipients tend to be single parents. Either they're home taking care of their kids, in which case their ability to work is severely hampered, or they probably have to pay somebody to watch their kids, which probably eats up nearly all of a low-wage salary. There's the real dilemma. Job training and workfare programs are fine, but who is taking care of the workers' preschool children while they're going through these programs? No minimum wage job is going to cover the cost of decent child care, and even if it did, no child care worker is going to give kids the kind of parenting their mother and father could give. There's not a lot government can do in this situation except work on programs that aid kids directly. Programs like Head Start that teach basic social skills and comprehension can do a phenomenal job with underprivileged kids. Likewise, school lunch programs can help make sure that kids eat well at least once a day. Medicaid programs can pick up the tab for their basic health care, but no government program can take the place of an involved parent. What can government do about that? One very practical thing government can do in this situation is go after the parent that isn't contributing to the child's upbringing. We're long overdue in this country for a nationwide crackdown on parents who don't pay child support and don't contribute to their children's upbringing. Beyond that, it's up to parents themselves to come up with creative solutions. What about home-based businesses with flexible hours that would allow single parents to work around their children's schedules? What about co-opting with other single parents so there's always a parent there? What about getting help from family and working an evening or graveyard shift that has you home for a substantial number of the child's waking hours? There are dozens of ways to solve this problem short of expecting the government to pay for childcare. But it is up to us to get creative and come up with solutions. Government's job should only be to assist us with these solutions. Ultimately, the best possible cure for poverty, joblessness, and all the other problems that cause people to seek out welfare is prevention. I think we spend far too much money and energy on mopping up the aftermath, and far too little effort on helping people avoid bad situations in the first place. Prevention is expensive too, but in the long run, it costs only a fraction of what it takes to try to repair these kinds of problems once they occur. Sooner or later, we're going to have to face the fact that a certain amount of poverty in this country is reinforced and made worse by certain people's attitudes. Some people, and this has nothing to do with any particular race or culture, are held back from prosperity by their own distrust of authority, lack of work ethic, and lack of any kind of vision for their own lives. It's an ugly idea, and nobody wants to hear it. That's why politicians seldom express it. But there's an aspect to poverty that is learned and passed on from generation to generation. And short of educational programs, it's a realm that government can't touch. We need to work on this as a community, through programs and volunteering in the private sector. We need to teach better parenting skills and parental responsibility. We need to find new and more effective ways to combat drug addiction. We need to raise kids from an early age with the idea that they have something to contribute to society and that it's their responsibility to get job skills and pay their own way in life. We should remember that welfare was created as a safety net for workers against fluctuations in the job market. It was launched after the Great Depression, when millions of hard-working, skilled people were thrown out of work. At that time, the government saw that some insurance was needed against downturns in the economy. That's what welfare was originally supposed to be. But today, it often functions as a catch-all for the unemployable. Welfare is a poor substitute for decent job training. I believe that the most effective scenario for dealing with poverty, given the kind of society we are, is for the private sector to take on most of the responsibility, and for the government to assist them in their efforts. We do a pretty good job of handling welfare here in Minnesota. Our plan in Minnesota is to channel our $173 million in federal welfare funds into two directions. Half of it will go to helping out those folks who fall through the cracks in the system. Minnesota's welfare program gives people a 5-year time limit. After that, they know they will have to be employed because their benefits will run out. But even with 5 years leeway, there are going to be people who fall through the cracks and won't be prepared when their 5 years is up. We'll have about $86 million on hand to help those folks back on their feet. The other half we're going to invest in a partnership with Habitat for Humanity to provide people with affordable housing. Stable, low-cost housing is a major problem for people who are struggling with poverty and fighting to stay employed. It's tough enough for people who move voluntarily every 5 years or so. Can you imagine what that does to your life to have to move involuntarily about every 6 months? Kids really suffer the most from this, being yanked in and out of different schools, There are kids who can't get their high school degrees because they're moving so much. Habitat for Humanity is a much better alternative to the housing projects of the 1950s and 1960s that are now nothing but run-down slums. The people whose houses they're building get to participate. They have pride of ownership when it's all done. They've put something of themselves into it, so they're not as likely to abuse it and let it get run down. Once they sweat a little bit and pound some nails, they're much more involved. This is an example of what I'm talking about when I say government should be working in partnership with the private sector. It's a very effective alternative to the way welfare has usually been handled. Healthcare is another important topic I want to talk about. There's an irony inherent in the whole issue of healthcare. Most of our lives we don't need it, but when we finally do, we can't afford it. I think that when we look at the issue of health care, we need to find ways that we can make sure it's paid for when we do need it, rather than wasting all this money paying for health care we don't use. I don't support nationalized health care. I think any time you get a system where there's only one provider, you get corruption. Competition creates better service and keeps prices down. I think we do need to keep an eye on HMOs, though. Many of them are going a little overboard on being cost-efficient. Plenty of horror stories have come from HMO patients who say they were denied medical care they needed because it was too expensive. By its very nature, medical care can't be purely capitalist venture. If it becomes only about making money, we get to the point where we're messing with the people's lives and health just to make a buck. We do need to have some kind of regulation or watchdogging system in place to keep HMOs from getting out of hand. I believe that it's government's job to step in when an individual can't afford his or her own health care. We have a pretty decent system here in Minnesota called Minnesota Care. It pays the medical bills for people who can't afford them with money that it raises from a small tax on everybody else's medical bills. But the more we as a society can do on the end of prevention, the less money any of us will have to spend on medical care. We need to make better choices regarding our health. We need to educate the public, especially kids, about the harmful effects of tobacco and excess drinking. We need to get smarter about the need to exercise. You don't have to become a triathlete just to stay healthy. A walk every evening after dinner is better than nothing. It's always easier and cheaper to stay healthy in the first place than it is to get treatment once you're ill. Now, let's turn to the ultimate no-win issue, abortion. I'm not pro-abortion. I don't think I could ever participate in an abortion. I would never encourage anybody to solve their problems by getting one. But does that mean I think abortion should be illegal? Nope. One of the best arguments I've ever heard for the legalization of abortion came from my mom. She was a nurse, and she remembers back in the days before abortion was legal, seeing the women who were rushed into the emergency room hemorrhaging uncontrollably from a do-it-yourself abortion that had gone wrong. More than a few women died from back-alley abortions, and many more became sterile. There are some things that legislation can't control. Just as with drug use, abortions don't stop because they're made illegal. They simply go underground where they become far more dangerous. Let me give you another reason why abortion should be legal. Imagine for a moment that you're a young woman with 3 small children. You find out you're pregnant again and you're thrilled. But then something goes wrong with the pregnancy. The doctor tells you you've developed a rare complication and that the fetus's life is threatening your own. If you try to carry this baby to term, you have a 95% chance of dying before 9 months is out. Suppose you decide you'd rather risk dying yourself than be responsible for terminating your baby's life. You're ready to put the situation into God's hands until one night your husband comes to you and pleads with you to reconsider. Suppose he says he can't take care of the 3 small children alone. He needs you, they need you. What do? Is the new child going to take that much importance over the kids that exist already? Do you even have the right to jeopardize your own life when you've got 4 other people who depend on you? Now let me ask you, whose decision should this be? The government's? Or should it be made by the woman and her family along with the support of her doctors and her clergy? How could the government possibly presume to tell her whether or not she should risk her life to bring this child to term? This is an extreme example, of course, but the point is that all of the viewpoints in making a decision like this, government's, is the least helpful. It's not so much that I think abortion should be legal as it is that I don't think it can be made illegal without abusing the Constitution. Unless the government barged in at the precise moment the woman was there in the operating room with her feet in the stirrups, how would the government know she was getting an abortion? How could they even know she was pregnant without an infringement upon her rights? Ultimately, no matter how I feel about it personally, I have to support keeping it legal because I don't think it's an issue that can or should be solved by politicians. The government has to stay out of this one. Crime, on the other hand, is an issue that politicians do get involved in. They love to crow about how tough they're going to get on crime. What does that mean anyway? What can a politician do about crime unless he's willing to pack his own heat out on the streets and kick some butt? When was the last time you saw a senator or a president do that? I'd be willing to bet that once these supposedly crime-tough politicians get into office, more than half of them forget all about doing anything about crime. Probably most of the other half pass a bunch of stupid laws that only duplicate laws that are already on the books, or they pork barrel money into more meaningless crime studies. There's only one way politicians can really affect crime, and that's to advocate that we make better use of the laws we've already got on the books. We have all the legislation we need. We have too much, in fact. We could probably throw away half of the criminal laws on the books and still get tough on crime, if we just get serious about enforcing those laws. I think we do a disservice to our society when we try to make prison into something it isn't. I really don't think American prisons are ever going to be much of a crime deterrent. Criminals aren't scared of prison in this country. The Constitution forbids us from really making it into something to fear because of the cruel and unusual punishment clause. We're fooling ourselves if we think criminals are going to toe the line just because we threaten them with prison. Prison should be viewed as a pragmatic necessity. It should be for getting violent offenders under control, locking them up where they can't do more harm. Anytime we get off track from this concept of prison, we end up costing the taxpayers more money with no real benefit to society. I don't think the way to get tough on crime is to lock away nonviolent offenders. I believe that prison is meant for the violent. There are probably dozens of alternatives to prison for nonviolent criminals. I'm partial to community service, personally, because when criminals work off their debt to society that way, it amounts to something society can actually benefit from. And in many cases, it can provide an eye-opening learning experience for the criminals themselves, if they're amenable to it. I don't believe that a free society like ours ought to have a death penalty. I'm not comfortable with the idea of granting the government the power to put its citizens to death. The margin for error is too great. I used to be pro-death penalty until I became governor, and I realized that I could actually hold in my hands the responsibility for decreeing someone's death. What would that feel like if I allowed somebody to be put to death, and then evidence surfaced a year or 10 years later that proved the dead person innocent? That margin for error is enough to convince me that we shouldn't be putting people to death. It's irreversible. Besides, in a civilized society, should the power of the government really be used to execute people? But there are a few things we need to get straight in our legal system before we can do away with the death penalty. Life in prison has to mean life. I doubt that maintaining a prisoner for life is going to be that much more expensive in the long run than all the endless appeals that an inmate on death row goes through. Besides, who's to say that a prison lifer couldn't earn his keep? I tried to explain that there are some things that legislation just can't do a good job of controlling. I was trying to get people to think, to brainstorm, to get creative, and maybe to generate some new ideas on how we could control these problems. But the media somehow decided that I was advocating legalizing drugs and prostitution, and they got all excited over that, so my message never got through. Whenever the subject came up, I always ended up having to spend time quashing the rumor that I wanted to make them legal. But when you look at the statistics on drug use in this country, it's pretty easy to see that our nation's war on drugs has failed. I may be one of the only political figures around with the guts to say this, but those few of us who are willing to say it are finally beginning to gain some supporters. There's got to be a better way to control drug use. When it comes right down to it, is it really the use of drugs that's causing the problems, or is it the violence and theft associated with the use of drugs? I believe the war on drugs is a failure for the same reason Prohibition was a failure. My mom told me about that. She lived through it. She saw that as soon as the government made alcohol consumption illegal, criminals cornered the market on liquor. Getting alcohol went from a safe, legal, affordable activity to one that often involved bloodshed and obscene amounts of money. And it gave rise to a half a dozen other crimes as well. It caused a huge groundswell in organized crime. It made a lot of criminals rich. Today, illegal drug use is doing the exact same thing. Just imagine if we could find some way for addicts to get their drugs cheaply, safely, and legally. The bottom would drop out of the illegal drug market. I'd be willing to bet if we did that, we'd see a huge drop in organized and violent crime. Finally, let's talk about one more hot social issue, family values. I find it humorous when politicians talk about family values. Many of them wouldn't know a family value if it bit them in the ass. I believe family values are about commitment. I think the real family values come through when times are tough, when people screw up, which we all do from time to time. It's the value of commitment that keeps families together and keeps them willing to turn themselves around and get back on the right path. All through the 1980s and 1990s, when family values was the hottest soundbite of the day, it seemed like every political candidate was scrambling to convince the voters that they were pro-family. Remember that? Politicians of the day had probably seen some statistic somewhere that told them that the vast majority of people in the voting booths had children. So they assumed that all they had to do was convince everybody of their wholesome, well-rounded image was to invoke the phrase family values. But while all these politicians were running around crowing about how they lived and breathed family values, the rest of us were standing back going, huh? It was a mindless, empty phrase, but it didn't have to be. If politicians had bothered to think it through, they could have made it mean something. We've been talking about the fact that a democratic republic requires a high-quality, self-reliant populace. And we've said that government can't do much to directly affect the quality of its people. So where do high-quality people come from? You got it, from families. Everybody in our society, whether they have a family or not, should be pro-family, for the same reasons they should be pro-education or pro-health. We all benefit from living in a community where people are self-sufficient, well-rounded, and emotionally healthy. And the best way to make sure people develop these qualities is to give them the chance to grow up in solid, loving families. Now, this is something very important for us to get straight. If I say that I'm pro-family, that doesn't mean I think everybody should run out, get married, and have kids. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being childless, whether you're single, married, gay, straight, or whatever. I have more respect for someone who acknowledges that they don't want kids than I do for someone who gets married and has kids just to go along with what they think society sees as respectable. But if you're going to create a family, then for God's sake see it through. Be there for your kids. Show them that marriages can last and work and stay strong. Make sure that you put their needs first. That's what family values are. If you're going to have a family, your responsibility to the family you create must be your number one value. I think we owe it to kids to do whatever we can to give them the ideal situation to grow up in. The best possible place for a kid to be raised is in a stable, loving, financially secure two-parent household, where one parent is female, the other is male, and where the two parents are married to each other and have figured out a way to stay married. Now, don't go ballistic on me yet. I said that's the ideal. Where we can create that environment for kids, that's what we should aim for. Anybody who's planning to make a family should be thinking in those terms. But does that mean that people who are in less than ideal circumstances can't do a great job raising a child? Of course they can. It's going to be a lot harder, and it isn't ideal, but it can be done. But you don't choose that from the beginning. You don't plan a less than optimal existence for your child. So does that mean that single people or gay couples shouldn't become parents? I think to answer that, you have to look at the reason why you want to become a parent, just as any married person should. If what you want is a sweet, cuddly little thing that will adore you and keep you from being lonely, who is there to fulfill your needs and not the other way around, then you should get a hamster, not a child. But if your goal is to be a parent, if you have a deep driving desire to care for and raise a child, and you're willing to sacrifice your own convenience and happiness to do what is necessary, then I have a question for you. Instead of making a brand new human being and bringing it into a less than ideal situation, why not adopt? There are so many kids out there in need of loving homes, older kids, and kids with health problems that nobody else wants. If you've got all this extra love to go around, why not give it to a kid that desperately needs it? Then, you're not robbing the kid of anything. You're taking the kid out of a bad situation and giving him or her a comparatively great situation. I believe that the only reason you hear talk these days about redefining families is that in this era of entitlement, the old definition of a family has become inconvenient for many people. Many people in our society today believe that they have a right to live however they want, and the fact that they have children shouldn't get in their way. But all you have to do is to look at juvenile crime statistics, and you'll see a huge correlation between crime and single-parent homes. The vast majority of families below the poverty line are also single-parent families. When parents aren't married or can't figure out a way to stay married, kids generally don't have a model for stability and commitment. And when parents are busy divorcing and dating and remarrying and bringing new kids into the family, expecting everybody to just get along for the sake of their happiness, it's no wonder so many kids from divorced homes have trouble adjusting. It might be a great situation for the parent, but it's chaos for the kid. Still think we ought to redefine the word family? Just remember, it ain't the kids asking us to do that. Kids' needs must come before adults' needs because kids can't take care of their own needs yet. We can. And I believe that one of the most frequently overlooked needs that children have is the need for a high-quality, ongoing relationship with parents who have time for them every day. Kids need for their parents to be around and available. Children don't understand the concept of, quote, quality time. That's another idea invented by parents who didn't want the inconvenience of rearranging their lives to fulfill their kids' needs. What children need is quantity time. They need you to be there a lot. When they need you, not when you have the time to squeeze them in. People are forgetting, in this era of personal liberty, that some choices are irreversible and some come with responsibilities. If you voluntarily bring a child into this world, your choice has been made. That choice is going to limit some of your options because you're obligated to care for that child to the best of your ability. You've given up some of your freedom for the privilege of being a parent. Having children means radically altering the course of your life for at least the next 20 years. If you're not willing to do that, don't have kids. Raising preschool kids is a full-time job. I know. My kids were little once. They needed to have someone with them all the time. That's just the nature of children. They learn independence gradually, over time. They have to be taught the skills they need for functioning in society. And who better to teach those skills than the parents? How much sense does it make to farm out the responsibility to a stranger? But I don't believe that just because you have kids, you're owed government support so you can take care of them. If you're going to have kids, you have to take the responsibility to plan ahead for their care. Hold off having kids if you have to, until one of you makes enough for the other to stay home full or part-time. It's only 5 years per child until they start school. It's not a lifetime. I often hear people say, "But doesn't happiness matter? I can only be a good parent if I'm happy." That's more bull. Being a responsible adult means you do what you have to do whether you're enjoying it or not. Mature adults aren't obsessed with whether they're happy every minute. They're focused on doing the right thing because they know it will turn out for the best in the long run. True happiness isn't about whether or not you're feeling cheery at any given moment. It's about the deep, long-term satisfaction of knowing you've lived an honorable life. A democratic society had better be pro-family if it knows what's good for it. A free society requires a populace that is capable of handling the responsibilities of freedom. Can a high-quality person come from less than ideal family circumstances? Sure, it's possible, but I wouldn't bet on those odds. Strong families are the best bet for developing solid, responsible people. But what's government's role in keeping America's families strong? Pretty minimal. Unfortunately, family life is a private matter. It's basically none of the government's business. That's what makes the, quote, family values politician such a joke. What can politics do, really, to strengthen families? Not much. We can pass legislation that helps families financially and doesn't penalize them for taking time from their careers to be with their kids. Beyond that, there isn't much government can do. This is another case where it's up to us. We have all the power in this situation by the choices we make. I truly believe that the reason I'm sitting in the governor's office today is because I'm committed to being forthright and honest. You may not always like what I have to say, but you know that whenever I give my opinion on something, it's what I really think, not what the pollsters have told me to say I think. I believe most people recognize that we have a severe sincerity deficit among our public officials these days. The people can see that poll chasing is not the same thing as genuine leadership, and that it isn't taking us where we need to go. They're hungry for honesty, even when it isn't pretty. A lot of politicians today circumnavigate the need for thinking through a given issue by simply following whatever the polls, their parties, or their campaign contributors tell them to do. That's taking the easy way out. As a public servant, my job isn't necessarily to follow popular opinion, although I always take the public's opinions into account, but to put my best efforts into understanding the issue at hand and deciding on a course of action that benefits the greatest number of people. That's the bottom line of what my job is all about. I form my opinions by observation, the same way I live my life. I don't decide what opinions make me look best or suit my interests and then go looking for facts to back them up. I look for facts first. Then I draw my conclusions from what those facts tell me. I consult the experts in a given field. That's why I hired the most qualified people I could get as my commissioners. I'll listen to what just about anybody has to say, but I don't take on their opinion as my own unless I've done my homework and seen they've got a point. I learned a valuable lesson from my Navy SEALs, which I've applied throughout my life. The SEALs taught me never to assume anything. That's one of the most important rules to apply as you're sifting through the issues of the day. Don't assume that what you're hearing is true. But on the other hand of the spectrum, though, you don't want to assume that it's not true either. That's just as foolish. It's hip these days to be cynical, but being across-the-board cynical is just the flip side of being naive. It's being naive with a bad attitude. The best thing you can do in order to spin-proof yourself is to listen for the basic assumptions in the information you hear, and go looking for evidence for and against them. Until you have that information and you have a chance to draw a solid conclusion from it, there's nothing in the world wrong with saying, "I don't know." I think I'm just about the only political figure these days who says that. It always gets a shocked response. Elected officials aren't supposed to say, "I don't know." But if you think about it, we don't know everything. We can't possibly have the answers to everything on the tips of our tongues. Rest assured, there are plenty of times that politicians don't know the answer to a question. They're just not willing to admit it. Professional politicians are masters of the slick response. They even pay people to help them gracefully cover up their ignorance. I grew up in the great era of the 60s and 70s when the rallying cry was "question authority." It's a great slogan and a smart policy. It's not telling you to reject authority altogether. It's not saying that authority is necessarily wrong. It's just reminding you not to accept what you hear blindly. That's healthy. We need to do much more of that today, especially given the corruption in our media and our politics. These days, we're all too ready to believe anybody who sets themselves up as an authority as long as they're cynical. But cynicism is a poor substitute for thinking things through. Ultimately, in a democratic society, there's no getting around the need for the public to be able to think for themselves. And if we want to fix what's wrong with our political system and our irresponsible press, we're all going to have to work a lot harder at making up our own minds. I'm going to tell you now about the most common fallacies you hear from public figures and the media today, so that we can recognize them and arm ourselves against them. My purpose here is to educate. I'm going to help you tune up your BS meter so that you can quickly identify this stuff when you hear it. Often these tricks are pulled intentionally, but at other times they're simply the result of poor thinking habits or ignorance. We can fight back with knowledge. The more we become aware of the way facts are manipulated behind the scenes, the better we'll be able to decide for ourselves what we're going to believe. Here are 9 tricks and traps politicians, the media, special interest groups, and spin doctors use to make up your mind. They try to tell you something is true or right because it's popular. Back in the 1940s and 1950s, Chesterfield Cigarettes launched a series of ads featuring glamorous movie stars who said they smoked cigarettes for the good of their voices. Imagine trying to pull that off today. Cigarettes were wildly popular in that era because they were seen as a symbol of sophistication and glamour. Even then, I'd be willing to bet, there were reports going around that cigarettes were harmful, but millions of people chose to believe what famous movie stars told them. A similar mentality is operating in politics today. I believe that a good many of today's politicians have actually convinced themselves that right and popular are the same. Why else would they be so obsessed with the polls? What else are polls but demographic popularity contests? When you get tempted to follow the crowd, just remember that old bumper sticker from the 1970s telling you to eat shit because a million flies can't be wrong. Number 2, they overlook alternative viewpoints and actions in favor of the quick, easy, and politically expedient. Sometimes the best solutions to a problem aren't going to be the prettiest ones. Some solutions, like welfare reform and even tax reform, are going to cost money in the short run. but will save us a vast amount of money in the long run. We've become very nearsighted in our political thinking, and we can't afford to be that way much longer. Politicians often capitalize on our obsession with the quick fix and the short haul. They throw their lot in with the most attractive solution and ignore the others. Then they try to rally us to their cause by denouncing all other viewpoints. We need to train ourselves not to automatically buy into, quote, feel-good solutions to complex problems. We shouldn't assume that because a particular course of action for a given problem has been portrayed negatively, that means it doesn't have worth. Remember, there are tons of people out there who have ulterior motives in the way they present certain ideas or potential legislation. Number 3, they try to make you think of issues in extreme terms. You can't, quote, win in a political contest unless you have an opponent. It's a common trick of politicians to set every issue up as a contest between two sides. Often, in order to make themselves look good, they'll paint the other side in the most extreme terms possible, so that it looks like their side is the more moderate choice. All this does is misrepresent the issue and limit your options. The assumption is that if you're not hardcore on one side of an issue, you must be hardcore on the other. This is the thinking that's behind all wedge issues. Case in point. I don't know how many times I've been approached by someone who thinks that I'm advocating the wholesale legalization of drugs. I think making all drugs legal tomorrow would be a horrible idea. But as I've said again and again, we have to come up with some other alternatives, because the way we've approached drugs in the past simply doesn't work. There are probably an infinite number of options between an all-out criminalization of drugs and an all-out legalization of drugs. But somehow, all of this gets boiled down to two extreme, skewed choices. We can't let ourselves get roped into limiting our options. If you're not a liberal, that doesn't mean you're a conservative. If you're pro-family, it doesn't mean you're anti-gay or anti-single or anti-anybody. If you're pro-choice, that doesn't mean you can't be anti-abortion. Don't let anybody convince you you have to be one extreme or the other. Free thinkers have more choices than that. Number 4. They leave out important information and emphasize only information that promotes their viewpoint. Opinion pollsters are notorious for this. They often tend to simply trash all results that are unfavorable and keep going until they get something favorable. Your best defense against this kind of trick is not to assume that you have all the information. It's always healthy to look for a second opinion. If it's an issue that really matters to you, there's nothing wrong with doing a little detective work on your own. With the internet, you have instant access to a wide variety of information on just about any topic. Number 5. They attack the person rather than their argument. This is a weapon of choice for today's media, but it's prevalent in just about every facet of public and professional life. It's painfully easy to make a bad label stick these days. I've talked to teachers who are terrified somebody's going to charge them with molestation. That's all it takes, is for somebody to make the charge. It's a modern-day witch hunt. They could be completely innocent and even prove it in court, but once they've had the word molester put in front of their names, many find they're unable to get rid of it. The same holds true of charging someone in the business world with sexual harassment. Everyone remembers the charge, not the dismissal of the charge. Name-calling is a popular tactic because it works. I'm reminded of the politician of a century ago who announced that his opponent was known to have matriculated at college, that his brother was a practicing Homo sapiens, and that his sister was a thespian. That politician won the election. I've had a ridiculous number of obnoxious labels used to describe me. Luckily, none have stuck so far. I've been called a bigot, a musclehead, an idiot, and even a bullet-headed, shovel-faced mother. And I've heard endless variations of my former moniker, Jesse the Body. It's a lot easier to throw unkind names around than to actually debate the issues, isn't it? The minute I hear a public figure ridiculing somebody instead of arguing the facts, I'm suspicious. We should bear in mind that if they're stooping to name-calling, it's either because they can't be bothered to fight fair or because they don't have a solid argument behind them. Number 6, they caricature the opposition to make themselves look good by comparison. This is a close companion to name-calling, personal attack school of debate. The way this one works is to take your opponent's point of view and misrepresent it until it's easy to knock down. They call this the, quote, straw man tactic in the language of debate. Again, our best defense is to stay informed. If something seems hard to believe, you're probably right to trust that instinct. Chances are, if you go looking for more information, your suspicions will be borne out. Number 7, they generalize from incomplete information. The media are masters of generalization. Reporters often pass along information without finding out what it means. I feel especially sorry for pilots because they seem to get picked on a lot. Just about every time a private plane crashes, the media are always quick to point out that, quote, the pilot had not filed a flight plan, as if that had something to do with the crash. Private pilots aren't required to file a flight plan. They generally do it just for an extra bit of protection so that somebody officially knows where they're going and when, but it's not required. No airplane yet has fallen out of the sky because it didn't have a flight plan. If your source of news is in the habit of making generalized assumptions in lieu of actual facts, I'd suggest to you that it's time to look elsewhere for your news. The problem is, it's so prevalent these days, it's hard to find a news source that consistently does its homework. But when you hear a reporter drawing a conclusion from a given story, just stop and ask yourself if that conclusion is really warranted. Sometimes what sounds like a conclusion is nothing more than an editorial opinion dressed up in story clothes. Also remember that the average reporter doesn't usually have any special expertise about the subject, but usually only reports what others have said. And, as often as not, because the reporter doesn't fully understand the subject, the report is oversimplified, generalized, and oftentimes just plain wrong. Number 8, they peddle their points of view by appealing to emotion. You see this kind of thing over and over again in an election year. Special interest groups love to say of a given piece of legislation that it, quote, hurts working families. It's very effective because it provokes an immediate emotional reaction. If I let this legislation get passed, I'll become unemployed and my kids will starve. That's all they have to do in a lot of cases. Drag out the, quote, bad for working families slogan, and it's almost guaranteed to kill any legislation, even legislation that would ultimately benefit working families. We need to stay focused on the facts in a case like this. Sure, we should give our emotional reaction at least some consideration, but it's no substitute for examining the facts. Don't let them play your emotions like a cheap fiddle. And finally, number 9, they oversimplify. It's a lot easier to get people behind you when you can articulate a single, clear, easily understandable reason for a given social problem and a single, simple solution. This is the logic behind every soundbite. But it reduces complex issues to nonsense and often masks the true nature of a problem. It leads us to assume that there is only one cause when there might be many, and to assume that the solution is singular. Nobody wants a politician to tell them that there's nothing he or she can do about a given problem, but sometimes that's just the way it is. We need to train ourselves to resist the urge to assume that a complex problem can have a simple solution. Here again, there's no substitute for doing our homework. But the out-and-out lie from a politician is probably a bit rarer than another kind of lie, doctored statistics. Polls are manipulated, loaded, and skewed all the time so that they'll yield whatever so-called facts the politician wants to promote. Then anytime they're challenged on a particular policy, they can point to their highly manipulated statistics. When somebody gives you an average, be suspicious as hell, especially if they don't tell you what kind of average it is. There are many different types of averages, and the results they yield vary widely. You may have heard the old saying, quote, "Nearly everybody is below average." Averages are meaningless unless they're backed up with an explanation of what type of averages they are and how the source arrived at that number. There are all kinds of ways to express a number, depending on the impression you want to give. For example, a local real estate company might advertise that they have 80 years of experience in the business. Sounds impressive, right? But if you investigate further, it'll turn out that they've only been open for 4 years, and their 20 realtors were all brand new to the business when they started. Or worse, what if they've got 80 employees and the company's only been open a year? Everybody in the company is a bare-bones beginner, and yet, with those numbers, they can make it sound like the most experienced real estate firm around. I truly believe that the best way for all of us to combat all of these tricks is to become experts at thinking for ourselves. Every citizen needs to understand the basics of sound thinking and needs to apply them by staying informed. The more you're armed with good information, the less any of these tricks are going to work on you. Darrell Huff, author of How to Lie with Statistics, writes that there are 5 questions we should ask of any statistic we hear. First, who says so? We should ask ourselves whether the source could be biased, consciously or unconsciously. Is it possible that they didn't tell us about the unfavorable data and only reported what supports their position? Second, we should ask, how do the sources know that what they're saying is true? If they conducted a survey, was their sample big enough to be reliable? Was their sample really representative of the group they claim to represent? Third, what's missing? If they don't tell you how they arrived at their conclusion, that's a reason for suspicion. Fourth, is one thing being reported as another? Oftentimes, polls are meaningless because what people say they do and what they actually do are different. And finally, does their conclusion make sense? We tend to get lulled into a false sense of security by statistics and percentages. We'll accept a conclusion that's got legitimate-looking numbers attached to it, even though the conclusion itself is ridiculous. Don't get roped in. Question the statistics you hear. Question the conclusions they draw. Question the source. Ultimately, we all have to take responsibility for the information we consume. We need to become smarter news consumers. We have to train ourselves to go for the nutritious stuff, not the candy news that's all around us these days. I think if we start placing a higher priority on staying informed, we'd work harder to carve out niches in our busy schedules to at least scan the top stories. Even if we don't have the luxury of a few free minutes, there's bathroom time, commuting time, time on hold. We make time for what's important. Ideally, we ought to be getting our information from several different reliable sources. We should never let any one news source become our sole authority. If anybody tells you they're the only source of information you need, chances are they've got ulterior motives, so run like hell. But of course, staying informed is only the beginning. As a wise Eastern philosopher once put it, quote, "To know and not to do is not truly yet to know." We all have a responsibility to participate in keeping our country strong. We are the people our founding fathers meant when they wrote about a government by, for, and of the people. We have to put our knowledge into action. When we have an opinion, we need to make ourselves heard. I know that's not easy in today's climate. All you have to do these days is be seen in public holding an opinion, and you've made yourself a target. But we can't knuckle under to that. We have to have the courage to speak our minds anyway. Of course, the most direct form of putting our political opinions into action is with our vote. Low voter turnout is a vicious circle. The smaller the number of people who vote, the less government represents the public. When people begin to feel that government doesn't represent them, they start to feel that their vote doesn't make a difference. And the less people feel that their vote makes a difference, the less likely they are to vote. We have to turn that around. When I was elected governor, people came out of hibernation in record numbers to cast their vote. Many of these folks hadn't voted in years, or had never voted at all before. I believe that election was an indicator of something big on the horizon. Now is a great time to get back into the voting booth. There's a growing wave of momentum behind the reform movement. If you're coming back to the polls for the first time in years, you're in great company. Another way you can serve your country and put your knowledge to work is through volunteering. If you've got a candidate you want to get behind, go to his or her local campaign headquarters and help out. There's real power in actually getting in there and participating firsthand in a grassroots campaign. It's exciting. It's fantastic. Don't miss out on the opportunity to be part of that at least once. And while you're at it, I'd like you to consider holding a public office of your own at some point in your life. You don't necessarily have to run for president. I wouldn't wish that job on anyone, but you could serve in a local office in your city or town. It's an outstanding opportunity to make a difference. Much of what's wrong in our government today can be blamed simply on the nature of all governments. That is, what happens to the best of them over time. Governments are corrupt by default. It's only by the conscious effort of the people that they are kept in line. But in order to get our government back on track and find a way to keep it there, we may have to get a little bit experimental. I'm going to suggest now some basic courses of action I believe we should be taking, along with some new policies we should consider trying in order to get our government back on track. I doubt that it's intentional, but in many ways our government seems to have developed a backwards attitude. Today's government often penalizes those citizens that behave well and rewards those that misbehave. A case in point, property taxes. If you keep your house in great shape and make improvements to it, you have to pay higher taxes. But if you have the ugliest house on the block, all peeling paint, sagging porches, and plywood over the windows, you get to pay a lower tax rate. Another example is the way government insists on taking money away from you whenever you try to save it. The government actually penalizes you for saving money by hitting you with estate taxes and interest income taxes and gift taxes. And it's not just a bias the government has against responsible individuals. The federal government penalizes state governments for being efficient. If you handle federal money well, you lose it. It's not that the federal government is out there trying to be a tyrant. It's just that public servants' minds are elsewhere. Nobody's seeing the big picture. We need to get government to look at things differently. It's very short-sighted for the government to stick its hand out every time it gets a whiff of money. It would be a lot smarter in the long run for government to make policy that will encourage the kinds of behaviors it wants to see, not for the government's sake, but for the citizens' sake. Government policy should always be guided by what is ultimately best for the people. This seems like common sense, doesn't it? But it's amazing how much of government is run by an entirely different criteria. A prime example is the way that elected officials generally appoint their administrations these days. Rather than looking for the most qualified people to do the jobs, newly elected officials generally fill those positions with the people who supported their campaigns. They dole out offices in their administration as political favors, and they make sure to put their party's people into position. Their criteria is not who's going to do the best job, but who's going to support them and promote them and help keep them in place when it comes time for the next election. As a result, the quality of our government suffers. I took an unusual approach to appointing my administration. I simply appointed the best and most qualified person to every position. I figured the best way to work it was to give the job to the person who could do it best, then get out of their way and let them do it. I figured if they excel at their jobs, then I'll shine. Professional headhunters volunteered to find candidates for each position, the same guys who are out there recruiting for top corporations. I sent them out to find the best people they could get from the private sector. I was totally blind to political affiliation. I never even looked at what party they belonged to until after I hired them. Interestingly enough, what I ended up with was a pretty even mix of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And they are a phenomenal bunch of people. Even Skip Humphrey, my Democratic opponent, once came up to me and said, "You have the best administration in the United States of America." But isn't this how it's supposed to be done? How is it in the public interest to do it any other way? But it's tough to get good people into public service because the pay is lousy. When you consider what they have to sacrifice financially to do the job, you wonder why anyone would have an incentive to do it. None of my commissioners make six figures, even though they could probably be making $250,000 a year in the private sector. That drastic a pay cut is enough to keep plenty of great people out of public service. Why should they get paid less than what they're worth? But the real sticker isn't the money, it's the scrutiny they have to endure from the media. Rest assured, if you go into politics, you're going to get pounced on. The media will do whatever it takes to dig up dirt and create a scandal. The loss of privacy can be even more painful than the loss of income. Why should anyone have to go through that just to do public service? I fight against this all the time by defending my people publicly whenever the media abuses them. As governor, I'm like the captain of a ship, and the captain is honor-bound to defend his crew, but I've got to admit, it's like swimming against the tide. The media is relentless these days. We're missing out on a lot of terrific leadership because public service has become such a painful, impractical proposition. It's not much of a recruiting pitch, less money, more abuse. But for those who do sacrifice the private sector pay and take on the media gauntlet, that's only half of it, because they have to wade through an awful lot of bureaucracy. So much of business as usual in politics seems to be done in the most impractical way possible. When I first took office, I was surprised to find out that Arne Carlson, the governor before me, never even held meetings of department heads. Carlson's was a typical administration in that it was top-down. He gave the orders and everyone below him carried them out. There was little or no communication between departments. One of the first things I did was to go out and meet with all the heads of the different departments. Then I got them all together for an introductory session. Now I make a policy of bringing all my department heads together in one room once a month so everybody gets to look at the big picture together. Since then, we've been working hard at taking down the barricades between departments. The way it's been in the past, one department typically doesn't even know what the other departments are doing. We're helping them learn to communicate with each other. In some cases, they were inadvertently duplicating each other. I found out there were 4 or 5 departments that deal with alcoholism. We need to cut it down to 1. In the private sector, that would be common sense. In government, it's radical thinking. My father used to say, "You want to know why they're all crooks in government? Because they spend $1 million to make $100,000 a year." He had a point. There's power and prestige to be had in high public offices. And in our current electoral system, power and influence are bought. The cost of campaigning severely limits the field of candidates. Who has that kind of money? Only a tiny handful of Americans can manage it. And if you think the threshold is high at the presidential level, just try running for Congress, where you get no public financing at all. Third-party candidates are constantly getting spent to death by the two major parties. It has nothing to do with the quality of their candidates. If they can't afford to get their candidates out there in the public eye alongside the major parties' contenders, no one's going to know another choice exists. I suspect most Americans would agree with me that we need a major overhaul of our campaign system, and I believe that as we work through the campaign reform, we need to keep as our goal the idea that what matters most in any campaign is the candidates stand on the issues. Not who's telegenic and slick in front of the cameras, not who's winning the debates, not who's grabbing up the black, gay, Hispanic, or female vote, but who's got a genuine plan for governing. Above all, we need to arrange it so it's not a matter of winning being the candidate who's got the most bucks. We need to find a way to level the playing field so that the wealthy candidate doesn't spend all the others into the dust. I'm not generally a socialist, but on this issue, I think we need to even things out. The media could provide an equal block of free airtime to each candidate. How you'd make that work, I'm not sure, but I think we need to be talking about it. A more equal campaign system would mean that government or donated funds or some combination of public and private funds would be distributed equally among all qualified candidates. We'd probably get challenged in court if we tried to do that. Somebody would say it violated the First Amendment. I would argue against that, though. We already have limits on campaign donations, and these laws have passed the constitutional test. The principle is the same. It's just a matter of degree. Not only are elections obscenely expensive, there's too damn many of them. Why do we have to have elections every 2 years? The system works fine for senators who serve a 6-year term, but congresspeople serve only 2 years. It often works out that a rookie congressperson spends the first year learning the ropes, then spends the second year, an election year, campaigning again. If they don't win the election the second time around, it's all for nothing. It limits what they can do and forces them to focus on quick fixes that will sound good in campaign literature, not on sound long-term solutions. Why not do away with the 2-year electoral cycle in favor of a 4-year cycle for everybody? I believe that all elected offices should be 4-year terms and all should be voted on the same year. That way, we get a 3-year respite from all campaigning, 3 whole years in which our elected officials have nothing to do except concentrate on the jobs we hired them to do. Another important way to get our nation back on track is to streamline government at the state level through unicameral legislation. I doubt that much of the American public is aware of this, but within the two parties, a small minority controls all of the other party members. You've got a handful on one side and a handful on the other who are the real power brokers. They're the ones that come to me to do the real negotiating. They're the real mediators between governor and legislature. They have the real influence over what will happen on a bill. The rest are just cannon fodder. Here in Minnesota, to show you how bad it can get, 10% of the legislators sit on 86% of the conference committees. You figure those odds out and tell me who's really wielding the political power. That's what the two-party system, the caucuses, and the conference committees create. That's why I'm in favor of a unicameral legislature. Unicameral legislature is very citizen-friendly, very open. Bicameral legislature makes all kinds of opportunities for bipartisan manipulation. I've been studying the idea of unicameral legislation for some time now, and I've come to the conclusion that it really is the hottest ticket around for true government reform. Switching state governments from bicameral to unicameral legislation not only trims an entire redundant layer away from the government, it also fixes a half a dozen other problems. I'm all for bicameral legislation at the federal level. It's absolutely required. You need to have both houses to even out the differences in population from state to state. If you only had one house with 2 senators from each state, Rhode Island would have a huge amount of representation and Californians would have hardly any. Or, if you only had a House of Representatives with everybody represented according to population, you'd have the opposite problem. Congress would be overrun with Californians and Texans, with only a tiny sprinkling of Delawareans and Rhode Islanders. At the federal level, the bicameral legislature makes sense. Not only that, it's constitutionally mandated. But it makes no sense at all at a state level. All bicameral legislation does for states is make a redundant layer of government. It's wasteful and it's expensive. Unicameral legislation is much more citizen-friendly. It makes every official stand on their own vote because they no longer have the mediating influence of the other house. They know they'll be held accountable, so they have an incentive to do their homework. Unicameral legislation, as we're constructing it here in Minnesota, puts an end to the conference committee, one of the most corrupt government institutions around. Today, most of the critical decisions in legislation are made by conference committees. Membership in these committees is exclusive. You have to butter the right palms to get in. In a unicameral legislature, there are no conference committees. It's all done out in the open. That's one less way for anyone to gain an unfair advantage. Unicameral legislation makes public servants more accessible to the people because it frees them up from a lot of bureaucratic red tape. The time House members would have spent shuttling legislation back and forth between both houses can now be spent making themselves accessible to the people. Plus, a switch to unicameral legislation frees up money from the salaries of those vacating the second house. We can then use that money to increase the pay for those in the remaining house. Better pay is likely to attract better legislators and may help wean them off special interest funds. Unicameral legislation should be a mainstay of any state government's reform platform. It's one of those great solutions that hits a number of problem spots all at once. So far, only Nebraska has gone with a unicameral system. They've had theirs for years, and it's served them well. I'm going to try to get the issue on the Minnesota ballot for the next election. If the people decide they want to try it, we'll be ready. While I have many more ideas for getting our nation back on track, I'd like to talk here about one more important issue: tax reform. Pick out any given American walking down the street, tap him or her on the shoulder, and ask what he or she thinks about the IRS. I can almost guarantee the reaction you'd get. A huge majority of us believe that the IRS has become corrupt, greedy, and way too powerful. Our tax system as it currently exists is a nightmare. It's stuffed with loopholes and unfair advantages. With the income tax system we have now, the IRS has almost unlimited power. They can take as much of your money as they want, and unless you're self-employed, they take it before you even get your check. Our forefathers would be appalled to hear today that the government gets your money before you do. The IRS is even allowed to act in direct contradiction to the Constitution. Do you know what an audit does? It assumes you're guilty. You have to prove yourself innocent. That's the exact opposite of the way our justice system works. I've been audited twice, and I'm here to tell you that even if they find you completely blameless, you're out of a hell of a lot of money and time. The money you paid to an accountant to help you plow through it all can never be recovered. The IRS is the epitome of bloated, corrupt, wasteful government, and if we're serious about government reform, the IRS deserves to take the biggest hit. Whatever we decide to do about tax reform, it's got to be a sweeping, complete revolution. It has to be a vastly more simplified system with clear limitations on the amount of money the government can take. Otherwise, the government will continue to find ways of snapping up more than its share by taxing us 3 or 4 times for the same dollar, and plenty of people will find a way to loophole their way out of their responsibilities again. I'm not crazy about the idea of a flat tax for 2 reasons. The first reason is that even a flat tax is still an income tax. I think the 16th Amendment, the one granting the government the power to collect taxes on income, should be repealed. To make that happen, we would have to get the votes of 3/4 of the legislators. It would be extremely tough to do, but I think it would be worth trying. The other reason I'm against a flat tax is the fact that we've already got one. It's called Social Security, and look at what a mess that's in. I'd like to see us do away with the income tax entirely and go for a national sales tax. The federal government could collect the money it needs by placing a tax on the goods and services we buy. Then states could add their own taxes on top of that. A fair national sales tax wouldn't touch the necessities of life like food and clothing. It would make sure that the people were able to provide themselves with the basics before it collected any tax from them. Taxes would only be collected on optional purchases. That would make us, the taxpayers, much more powerful. We could decide how much tax we're going to pay by controlling our level of consumption. We would have the option of hanging on to our money and living off the basics, or of spending as much as we felt like spending. We wouldn't be penalized for saving or investing. We wouldn't have to hand the government money just because we're looking out for our own financial welfare. Just imagine, you'd be able to clear 7 years' worth of useless documents out of your attic. You'd never have to face another audit. You'd never have to waste your time and money preparing complicated forms. The IRS as we know it would become obsolete. With a national sales tax, we wouldn't have to do away with the IRS completely. We could just scale it down drastically and reverse its function. Instead of watchdogging us, the taxpayers, the IRS could keep an eye on the government. It could be reprogrammed to protect the people from government corruption. Wouldn't it be great to have the IRS swoop in and audit a government agency for buying $200 toilet seats instead of having it harass private citizens? An objection I've heard raised to the national sales tax is that it would upset our free market economy by raising the effective cost of consumer goods by 20 to 25%. But I believe the opposite is true because it puts the government in direct line with the economy. The better the economy is doing, the more money government collects. It would force the government to work hard to keep the economy strong. I like plans that get the government to focus on our best interests. That's the way it should be. Underlying all my suggestions for getting our nation back on track, there's been a consistent theme, my advocacy of minimal government. The 20th century saw a massive worldwide shift towards gigantic government. That's bad news for everybody, because historically, the bigger and more complex a government grows, the more wasteful and inefficient it becomes. It's especially bad for us. Gigantic, overgrown bureaucracies are particularly hazardous in a free society like ours. They invariably begin to control aspects of our lives that they have no business controlling. They lose touch with their citizens and become insular. They stop representing us. That's what we're facing today, a government that has outgrown us. If our founding fathers could see the size our federal government has grown to today, they would be shocked. They believe, as I do, that the federal government should be as utilitarian as possible. That is, it has no business doing anything more than providing the bare necessities. I'm an advocate of minimal government for much of the same reasons as the Founding Fathers. First, because I agree that it's government's nature to become corrupt. The bigger the government, the bigger the corruption. And second, I have a great deal of faith in people. I think, left on our own, we can take care of ourselves pretty well. We don't need the government to take care of us. I believe that government's job should be to assist us when we need assistance, but at all other times to stay out of our way. In terms of reforming government, I think we need to do a complete shakedown. I understand that sweeping change needs to be incremental and gradual. It makes no sense to rush in and change things hastily. But we do need to be rigorous and thorough. We need to scour every bureau, every program, and every department for wastefulness. Just as important, we need to reform government's basic attitude. We've got to retrain it to think in terms of efficiency, not growth. I believe that the government that serves us best is one that can keep its own growth in check, and one that never forgets who it exists to serve. On a raw midwinter day last February, Lieutenant Governor May Shunk and I stood outside the steps of the governor's residence and announced to reporters that we were leaving the National Reform Party. I explained to the crowd, based on what I have seen in prior years and especially in recent months, I have come to believe that the National Reform Party is hopelessly dysfunctional. In Minnesota, we cannot maintain our socially moderate identity while a right-winger heads our national ticket. I told them the National Party has become unworthy of my support and the support of the American people. It wasn't a decision I made frivolously. I thought about it long and hard. I consulted with people whose opinions I respect. I talked to Donald Trump about it, because he had recently joined the party and had even been considering a presidential run on the party's ticket until he realized how close the party's leadership was to anybody new. I like to think that I'm not a quitter, but there comes a time when quitting is the right thing to do. When you've faced a tough decision and you know you've made the right choice, there's a tremendous sensation of relief that washes over you. You feel 10 pounds lighter. We were so happy that day, we knew we'd done the right thing. At the governor's meeting in Washington later that month, President Clinton walked up and shook my hand and told me what I did took courage. He said quitting the party showed I had the courage of my convictions, because a move like that could have easily taken me out of the media spotlight. The media is used to coming to me for commentary on Reform Party issues, and now that they won't be doing that anymore, I stand to lose a lot of my national exposure. Today, when the media comes to me for a statement on the goings-on within the National Party, I say, "Go ask them what's going on. I no longer belong." Surprisingly, quitting the Reform Party seems like it's strengthened my standing as a national figure. Last year at the governor's convention, I had been seated in the middle of the room, in amongst everybody else. This year, I got a seat at the First Lady's table. When I shook the president's hand that night, I told him, if I'd have known that by quitting the Reform Party I'd have gotten to sit with the First Lady, I would have quit a year ago. I was sitting so close to the president this year that I even got to touch glasses with him during a toast. Now, in retrospect, I see the party was doomed from the start. The Reform Party failed because it was formed the wrong way. It was built around Ross Perot. Every facet of its construction was designed to keep him in power. Parties that are built on anything other than solid ideologies can't survive for long. Parties must be grown from the ground up like plants, not from the top down like corporations. Parties build their steam little by little, from grassroots movements and from local small elections. The National Reform Party started off as a tremendous idea, but then it degenerated. Perot wouldn't allow it to grow beyond him. Whenever the party showed signs of growing in a direction that didn't include Perot in the middle, he strangled all the growth out of it. He didn't want other reformers in high places, because that would mean they'd have power that he couldn't directly control. That's what I learned during my campaign in 1998. I realized that the Reform Party was saying one thing and doing another. The party was happy to back me with words, but they weren't interested in forking over any cash to help me with my campaign. Any legitimate party would have been pleased to have one of their own members in an office as high as governor. I was the first Reform Party member to make it to elected office that high. But the Perot loyalists took every opportunity to focus all of the attention back on Perot. My popularity was seen as a threat by the Perot loyalists. After the Playboy interview came out, Party Chairman Russ Verney, who was put in place by Perot, sent out impassioned letters and even went on television demanding that I resign from the party because I was, in his words, unfit to be a member. Yet when I later chose to quit for political reasons, Verney went on record saying, quote, Ventura had a chance to be a leader or a leaver, and he chose to leave. I think he was just mad because he couldn't force me out. The most convincing evidence to me that the party was going downhill was the arrival of Pat Buchanan. When Buchanan came in, the party lost all sense of direction. It ceased to be a centrist party at that moment. And along with Buchanan came a steady stream of political misfits and malcontents until the party had no idea what it stood for anymore. The media has tried to pin the blame on me for causing all the discord within the party. They tried to paint me as a would-be national reform leader butting heads with Perot in a bid to knock him off the party throne. But the truth is, I never had any intention of becoming a national leader. The whole issue is pure fiction. I never tried to take over the party. The party was in trouble long before I came onto the scene. But of course, wars make good news stories, and so the fictional battle raged on. And now that I've moved my party affiliation back to Minnesota's Independence Party, the media's at it again. Now they're trying to make it look like I want to control our state party. That's not true either. I want to be active in the party. I want to be a beneficial presence. But I've got enough on my plate right now just doing the job I was elected to do. On the other hand, I don't mind advising them. I did recommend to the State Reform Party here in Minnesota that they'd be better off disaffiliating from the National Reform Party. But when they voted last March, I didn't participate in the vote at all, because I knew if I did, the media would have said that Jesse Ventura was trying to take over the party. I wanted the committee members to look in the mirror and make the decision based on their own beliefs, without any pressure from me one way or the other. Their vote came in favor of disaffiliating. But if they hadn't voted to disaffiliate, I would have been ready to say goodbye to them too. I would have become a man without a party like Maine's Governor Angus King. That would have been nice too. Then I would have been truly independent in my thinking. It would have given me an additional amount of freedom. When the Minnesota Independence Party split from the National Party, we lost a few hardcore Perot supporters, but otherwise we're doing just fine. We've got a bunch of good candidates running in this election. If a number of them get in, we'll become a major contender for Minnesota's political power. We'll be able to make a minor dent in the two traditional parties' power base. The media is trying to say I want to dictate the Minnesota Party's platform, which isn't true. If I did, it would only prove that I hadn't learned anything from Perot's mistakes. Parties and the ideas they stand for shouldn't be dictated by a single personality. Besides, the Minnesota Reform Party already has a terrific platform of its own. It's still a work in progress, of course, every platform is, but it's very comprehensive and extremely well constructed. It deserves to stand as a model for other state reform parties. The party's overarching philosophy is to be socially inclusive, fiscally responsible, as our new official slogan puts it. We're not looking to court special social groups, like gays or pro-lifers or farmers. If we're going to stay true to our stance on independence, we need to keep our scope broader than that. The party is there for independent thinkers, regardless of any other group affiliation. One of the party's fundamental principles is that political power belongs to the people. It's only entrusted to those who serve in public office. All policy making should be based on the public good. The platform requires that the government be open with the public about financial matters. It insists on accurate reporting of all national debt and an open fiscal reporting policy for all government agencies and departments. It supports the Balanced Budget Amendment. It calls for the simplification of the tax system, both here in Minnesota and nationally, and for replacing Minnesota's bicameral legislature with a unicameral legislature. The party is very clear about its stand on campaign reform. It advocates eliminating campaign funding by PACs, unions, trade associations, and corporations, and it wants to make it so that every contribution to a candidate or to a political party must be publicly reported. On the issue of social welfare, the platform favors social programs that encourage self-sufficiency. It supports affordable housing and seeks to make medical costs and insurance premiums tax-deductible. Plus, it advocates making a basic level of health care available to all Minnesotans, regardless of income. The party doesn't take an official position about abortion or related issues because it holds these issues to be a matter of personal choice and none of the government's business. It promotes legislation that would allow parents to raise their children according to their own conscience and beliefs without interference or government intrusion, unless there's abuse or neglect going on. It gives more power and autonomy to parents and local school districts and cuts administration costs. The party has a terrific system for keeping its platform clear and coherent, while still allowing room for its members to go with their conscience on any given issue. The platform is made up of cornerstone planks, which require a 74% vote from the committee, and supporting planks, which have to get at least 60%. To get the party's endorsement, each candidate has to agree to support a majority or more of the supporting planks and at least 75% of the cornerstone planks. Each individual candidate decides which planks to support. Anything that isn't mentioned as a platform plank is left up to the individual candidate to decide in accordance with their own conscience. This system keeps the really diversive stuff out of the official platform, but still leaves room for candidates to go with their own conscience. The best thing the Minnesota Party can do now is to go back to what it was before Perot came along, which seems to be where they're headed. They recently voted to return to the name they had chosen for themselves at their inception in 1992, the Minnesota Independence Party. I'm happy with their choice. Independence reinforces the idea that our party members think for themselves. In the long run, I think independence describes us better than reform. Imagine a few years from now, once we have accomplished our major goals for government reform, what would we call ourselves then? Reform describes a temporary goal. Independence describes a permanent one. And when it comes time to re-affiliate nationally, independence may be the way to go. The New York Reformers Party already goes by the name Independence Party. The way is clear for us now to start getting the third party movement back on track. I'd like to see the Minnesota Independence Party stand as a model for other centrist third parties. Minnesota has always been a leader in reform. Our party has a very thorough and well-written constitution and solid leadership. I'd like to see other new centrist parties look to us for an example of how it's done. Someday it will be the right time for us to start affiliating nationally again. I thoroughly expect to see another national-level centrist reform party in the future after the Perot party has played itself out. But for the time being, I think we're better off getting back to grassroots level, strengthening ourselves at home so that we don't make the same mistakes again. A number of state reform parties have said that now that we've disaffiliated, they want to join us. But for now, we're keeping in mind the rules of war. Take care of your own backyard before you venture into somebody else's. I trust we'll know when the time is right to go national again. But I do believe that the third-party movement is here to stay. There's a huge gap in our political system that's waiting to be filled. And as long as the third-party movement has the presence of mind to fill that gap and provide the representation that's currently lacking, it will survive and thrive. A third party must by necessity be a centrist party. We already have representation of the two political extremes. It's the middle of the road that's lacking representation. Any third-party platform that's truly going to give the public an alternative to the two major parties must be devoutly centrist and moderate. A third party also needs to appeal to moderates in its stance towards the role of government in various aspects of our lives. Rather than being categorically for or against government's role on a given issue, it makes more sense to evaluate each issue on its own merits. Study after study has shown that the American public prefers practical solutions to its problems rather than the ideological solutions the two major parties often promote. Since third-party members are usually not married to one political ideology or another, they're free to evaluate each issue on its own merits. The great promise of the third-party movement is that it will free our government of narrow-minded, polarized thinking. It will generate a vast array of new choices for us, and it will allow us more opportunities to participate in the process of democracy. These are worthy goals for a nation of independent minds and free thinkers. The true measure of the greatness of this country is that we can choose to do this if we wish. If some part of our government isn't working the way we want it to, we have all the tools we need to fix it. Nothing in government is written in stone, and no matter how powerful the media, the lobbyists, the party power brokers, and the career politicians seem to be, we are the ultimate authority behind our government. It's still our government. We can shape it and focus it and reinvent it to better serve us all simply by the power of our choices. That's why I have such a tough time dealing with the apathy of people who complain about everything, but don't want to do anything to change it. I want to tell them, why are you complaining when you won't work with me? Why won't you help me change things? In many ways, the public is to blame for the political situation we're in because of their apathy. They re-elect incumbents over and over again because it's easier to stick with a known quantity and because they don't want to give up the power that entrenched politicians have amassed. And also, human nature is partly to blame. We just naturally fear change. When we get comfortable, it's hard for us to break out of that comfort level. But what's comfortable isn't necessarily what's right. One of the greatest strengths of the American people is that we truly are a nation of individuals. One person's action can make a difference. It may take courage to face up to entrenched bureaucracy, but we Americans have never been short on courage either. The heart of American politics remains in the silent majority. Career politicians, partisan power brokers, and special interest bullies have only been able to borrow political power from the people because we've allowed them to. If we're going to become the masters of our own political process again, we have a decision to make, because in the end, it all depends on whether or not the silent majority chooses to remain silent. Will you come forward and speak your mind, or do I truly stand alone?
Do I Stand Alone? Going to the Mat Against Political Pawns and Media Jackals was written and read by Governor Jesse Ventura. It was abridged for audio by Allison Chernow. The recording engineer was Ellie Mae Esterbrook at Cookhouse Recording Studios in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Editing and post-production by Common Mode, Paul Foley, Technical Director. The mix engineer was Rick Bradley. The associate producer was Sally Hurst. Do I Stand Alone? Going to the Mat Against Political Pawns and Media Jackals was produced and directed by Susan Perrin. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. Do I Stand Alone? Going to the Mat Against Political Pawns and Media Jackals is also available in book form from Pocket Books.